The night air over the Nile River was still warm even after the sun had disappeared beyond the western desert. Far away from the loudness of modern life, the ancient world rested beneath a sky filled with pale stars. Thin lines of smoke drifted slowly upward from cooking fires that had nearly burned out. Mud brick homes stood quietly beside narrow paths worn smooth by countless bare feet and leather sandals. Somewhere in the darkness, a donkey shifted softly in its sleep. The river moved slowly through the land, dark and calm beneath the moonlight. Inside one small house near the edge of a farming village, a young boy named Kiti lay awake on a woven reed mat beside his brothers. The air smelled faintly of dust, warm clay, old straw, and baked barley bread. His body ached from the long day behind him. His hands were rough for someone so young. Tiny cuts lined his fingers where reeds had scraped against his skin during the afternoon work beside the riverbanks. He listened quietly to the breathing of his family. His father slept heavily after hours spent lifting water from irrigation channels beneath the heat of the sun. His mother rested near the far wall with the younger children beside her. The room was crowded but peaceful. Outside, the village had become almost silent except for insects humming softly near the water. Kiti closed his eyes for a moment, though he knew sleep would come slowly tonight. Tomorrow would begin before sunrise once again. There would be grain to carry, nets to untangle, mud bricks to stack near the workshop yard. The days repeated themselves like the steady movement of the river itself. In ancient Egypt, childhood was often short and filled with work long before adulthood arrived. Young people learned patience not through lessons spoken gently in shaded classrooms, but through repetition, exhaustion, waiting, and responsibility. Their world moved slowly. Crops took time to grow. Clay needed time to dry beneath the sun. Floodwaters arrived in their season and disappeared in their season. Almost everything required endurance. And so children learned to endure. The village where Kiti lived rested not far from the Nile, surrounded by narrow green farmland that faded suddenly into wide stretches of pale desert earth. During daylight hours, the contrast between fertile land and dry wilderness felt sharp and almost endless. Palm trees swayed beside irrigation canals while distant dunes shimmered under waves of heat. Before dawn each morning, the village slowly awakened. The first sounds were usually quiet footsteps and low voices. Then came the scraping of pottery jars against stone floors. A mother grinding grain with a heavy stone. Someone coughing in the darkness before stepping outside into the cool early air. Goats stirring awake. Water splashing into clay containers. The children woke early too. There was rarely a choice about that. Young boys and girls learned quickly that sleeping late meant falling behind in the endless rhythm of labor that shaped village life. Even small tasks mattered. Carrying water from the river took time. Cleaning tools took time. Feeding animals took time. Every hour beneath the rising sun carried responsibilities waiting to be finished. Kiti often woke while the stars still filled the sky. His father would place a rough hand on his shoulder without speaking many words. The house remained dim except for the glow of a small oil lamp flickering against the mud walls. The mornings were almost peaceful then. Cool air drifted through the doorway. The village smelled faintly of wet earth and river reeds before the heat arrived. Sometimes Kiti wished those quiet moments could last forever. But they never lasted long. Soon the horizon brightened into soft shades of gray and pale orange. Workers emerged from their homes carrying baskets, ropes, wooden tools, and clay jars. Sandals pressed into dusty roads already marked by years of travel. The village slowly stretched awake beneath the coming sun. Kiti followed his father toward the fields each morning carrying more than his body wanted to carry. At first his arms had trembled under the weight of grain sacks or water jars. His shoulders had burned with soreness. Sometimes he wanted to complain. Sometimes he nearly cried from exhaustion. But ancient Egyptian children learned early that discomfort did not stop the work from continuing. Patience grew quietly inside them through long hours that could not be rushed. The fields beside the Nile demanded constant care. Irrigation channels clogged with mud and reeds. Crops needed watering before the worst heat arrived. Workers bent low beneath the sun for hours at a time while sweat darkened their linen clothing. Children joined the labor beside adults as naturally as birds following the wind. Khedi spent many mornings knee-deep in cool mud clearing small channels so river water could move properly across the farmland. The mud slid between his toes while insects buzzed around his face. His back hurt from bending. Sometimes the work felt endless. But there was beauty there too. The river reflected the morning sky in soft silver colors. Egrets stepped carefully through shallow water hunting fish. Palm leaves rustled gently overhead. Farmers spoke quietly to one another while distant cattle lowed across the fields. Life moved slowly enough that small details became part of daily memory. The smell of wet reeds beneath sunlight. The warmth of stone beneath tired feet. Fresh bread cooling near a doorway. Dust rising behind passing donkeys. Children in ancient Egypt learned patience partly because the world around them could not be hurried. The Nile itself taught this lesson year after year. When flood season arrived, the river spread across the land carrying rich dark soil into the fields. Villagers waited for the waters to retreat before planting crops. No amount of wishing could make the floods move faster. No amount of frustration changed the rhythm of nature. So people waited. Young people watched their parents endure these waiting periods calmly because survival depended upon accepting time as it came. The river decided much of life. Children grew up understanding this deeply even before they fully understood words for it. Khedi sometimes sat beside older fishermen during quiet afternoons near the docks. The men repaired torn nets while boats drifted softly against wooden posts. Warm wind carried the smell of fish, river mud, and sun-heated reeds. The fishermen worked slowly. There was no rushing delicate knots. One old fisherman named Mena often let Khedi help untangle damaged rope. The work required careful fingers and great patience. If Khedi pulled too hard, the knots tightened further. If he became frustrated, the rope only twisted more badly. Slow hands, Mena would murmur gently. Those words stayed with the boy for many years. Slow hands. Slow work. Slow days beneath a slow river sky. Patience was not taught through speeches. It was learned through the body itself. Through repetition. Through tired muscles. Through waiting for bread dough to rise beside cooking fires. Through standing quietly beside crowded marketplaces while adults finished trading grain or fish. Through long walks beneath the sun carrying heavy jars that pressed painfully into the shoulders. Many children in ancient Egypt worked inside crowded workshops where artisans shaped wood, carved stone, spun linen, or crafted pottery. These places smelled of dust, smoke, sweat, clay, and heated metal. Apprenticeship often began very young. Children watched skilled workers repeat the same careful movements day after day. A boy learning pottery might spend months only preparing clay. A girl weaving linen might spend endless hours untangling thread before touching an actual loom. The lessons were repetitive but deeply important. Skill arrived slowly. Nothing good came quickly. In another part of the village, a young girl named Tiaa worked beside her mother weaving linen inside a shaded courtyard. Thin strands of flax stretched across wooden frames while afternoon light filtered softly through hanging cloth. TIAA's fingers moved carefully as she separated fibers and twisted thread. The work often made her sleepy during the hottest part of the day. Flies buzzed lazily nearby. The air barely moved. Sweat gathered along her forehead while older women spoke quietly around her. TIAA sometimes watched dust drifting through beams of sunlight and imagined cooler places far beyond the desert horizon. Yet her hands continued moving because stopping meant delaying the work for everyone else. The linen needed finishing before traders arrived from larger towns farther north. Patience lived inside every thread she touched. The adults around her rarely raised their voices. Exhaustion itself created slowness. After hours beneath heat and labor, people moved with careful economy. Children absorbed this quiet rhythm naturally. Even meals reflected the slow pace of survival. Bread baking beside clay ovens took time. Lentils simmered slowly in pottery pots. Fish dried beneath the sun while families waited. Children learned hunger sometimes meant waiting calmly until food was ready. At night, families gathered beneath dim oil lamps while fatigue softened conversations into murmurs. Workers stretched aching legs. Mothers cleaned cooking bowls. Older grandparents sometimes told stories about river spirits, harvests, or journeys taken long ago. Children listened while sleep slowly pulled at their eyes. Kitty loved these moments most. Not because life became easier at night, but because darkness allowed rest to finally arrive. The air cooled slightly. The noise of labor faded. For a little while, nobody demanded more strength from tired bodies. Still, even rest carried reminders of hardship. The reed mats were thin. Mosquitoes drifted through open doorways. Summer heat lingered heavily inside small homes. Sometimes children woke coughing from smoke or dust. Illness spread easily in crowded villages near standing water. Many young people in ancient Egypt grew familiar with sickness early in life. Fever, stomach pain, infections from cuts or insect bites, fatigue from heat and poor nutrition. Yet life continued moving around them regardless. Families could not simply stop working for long. Survival depended on endurance shared across entire households. And so children learned patience through discomfort too. Kitty remembered one summer when illness spread through the village during the hottest weeks of the year. Several children became weak with fever. Workers moved more slowly beneath the crushing heat. Even the animals seemed exhausted. The riverbanks smelled stronger during those days, heavy with damp reeds and stagnant water. Flies gathered everywhere. The sunlight itself felt harsh enough to press against the skin like a weight. Kitty spent days carrying water for his mother while she cared for his younger sister, whose fever lasted many nights. He wanted desperately for her sickness to disappear immediately. But healing came slowly. So he waited. He sat quietly near her sleeping mat listening to her breathing while warm wind drifted through the doorway. Outside, life continued. Farmers still walked toward the fields each morning. Bread still baked. Donkeys still crossed dusty roads. Patience often meant accepting that some things could not be fixed quickly. Children learned this lesson over and over again. Along the Nile, seasons shaped every part of existence. During harvest months, villages became crowded with movement from dawn until nightfall. Workers cut grain beneath blazing sunlight while children gathered loose stalks from the ground behind them. Dust clung to sweaty skin. Hands blistered. The smell of dry straw filled the air endlessly. Harvest required speed before crops spoiled, yet even this urgency carried its own slow rhythm. Day after day workers repeated the same motions beneath the same sky. Children learned to continue despite aching muscles and exhaustion. At midday, many workers rested briefly in shaded areas beside walls or trees. Kitty often lay flat against cool ground during these moments, closing his eyes while older workers drank water nearby. The silence during those breaks felt deep and heavy. Only wind moving through palms. Only distant birds calling near the river. Only breathing. The adults rarely wasted energy speaking unnecessarily during hot afternoons. Children learned quietness from them too. Patience often sounded like silence. Years passed this way. Slowly. Steadily. The children of the village grew taller. Their hands became stronger. Their movements became more efficient. Tasks that once seemed impossible eventually felt ordinary. Kitty could now carry water jars without trembling. TIAA's weaving became smooth and practiced. Neither remembered exactly when these changes happened. Growth came gradually, almost invisibly, like the shifting riverbanks beside the Nile. That was another lesson hardship taught them. Real change rarely arrived suddenly. One evening near the end of flood season, Kitty walked alone beside the river after finishing work. The sky glowed deep orange while boats drifted lazily across darkening water. Workers returned home carrying tools over tired shoulders. Somewhere nearby, bread baked inside clay ovens, filling the air with warm comforting smells. Kitty sat near the reeds and watched the current move slowly southward. He thought about how many days of labor had already filled his young life. How many mornings had begun before sunrise. How many heavy baskets he had carried. How many hours he had spent waiting for crops, waiting for floods, waiting for sickness to pass, waiting for cooler air after brutal afternoons. The river kept moving calmly beside him. Always patient. Always steady. And perhaps without realizing it completely, Kitty had begun to move that way too. Not because hardship disappeared. Not because life became easy. But because endurance slowly shaped the hearts of young people living in that ancient land beside the Nile. The stars appeared one by one above the quiet water. Night settled softly over the village again. And somewhere behind him, families prepared once more for another long day waiting beyond the darkness. The moon drifted higher above the Nile while most of the village slept beneath roofs of mud brick and bundled reeds. Night insects hummed softly along the riverbanks. The darkness carried its own gentle warmth, though the heavy heat of the day had finally loosened its grip on the land. Kitty remained awake for a little while longer beside the water. The river reflected pale silver light across its slow-moving surface. Small ripples touched the muddy shore with a quiet rhythm that seemed older than memory itself. Far across the water, another village rested in silence beneath clusters of date palms. A faint dog barked once in the distance, then the world became still again. The boy wrapped his arms around his knees and listened. Ancient Egypt was rarely completely silent. Even at night there were always soft sounds drifting through the darkness. Water moving against boats. Wind brushing dry reeds together. Someone coughing inside a nearby house. The low shifting of cattle resting beside fenced enclosures. But compared to the hard brightness of day, nighttime felt peaceful. The labor stopped for a few hours. The shouting of merchants faded. Tools rested. Tired bodies finally became still. Kitty eventually stood and walked slowly back through the narrow village paths. Dust cooled beneath his bare feet. Clay walls glowed faintly beneath moonlight. Some homes still held dim flickers of oil lamps where mothers finished late work repairing clothing or preparing grain for morning meals. As he passed one open doorway, he smelled onions cooking slowly beside flat bread warming on hot stone. The scent drifted gently into the night air. Inside, an elderly woman sat weaving reeds into baskets while two small children slept beside her. Her hands moved carefully despite the late hour. There was always work remaining. Always another task waiting quietly nearby. Even so, the village carried a deep feeling of endurance rather than hurry. People worked because life demanded it, not because they expected comfort or reward. Children understood this from their earliest memories. Kitty slipped quietly back inside his family's house and lay down again upon the woven mat. His younger brother shifted beside him, half asleep, murmuring softly. The room smelled of dust, sweat, lamp smoke, and dried straw stored near the wall for animal feed. Soon the boy drifted into sleep at last. Only a few hours later, before dawn had fully arrived, his father's hand touched his shoulder once more. The cycle began again. Outside, the eastern sky showed only the faintest gray light. The village emerged slowly from darkness like something waking reluctantly from a dream. Workers stepped into the cool air carrying baskets and tools while sleepy children rubbed dust from their eyes. Morning near the Nile often held a fragile beauty that disappeared quickly after sunrise. Mist hovered low over irrigation canals. Birds called softly from palm trees. The earth smelled damp and alive before the desert heat returned. Kitty and his father walked toward the river carrying empty clay jars balanced carefully against their hips. Other villagers moved beside them in silence, too tired to waste energy speaking so early. The river water felt cool against Kitty's hands as he lowered the jars beneath the surface. Small fish darted away through cloudy ripples. Nearby, women washed linen against smooth stones while young children played carefully near the shallows under watchful eyes. One little girl laughed as water splashed across her legs, though her mother quickly pulled her back from deeper currents. Even play near the Nile carried caution. The river gave life, but it also demanded respect. Patience often meant learning carefulness. Children who rushed carelessly could easily injure themselves with tools, fall from boats, damage precious goods, or disappear beneath dangerous water. Ancient Egyptian villages depended upon steady hands and measured movement. Young people learned early that calmness mattered. As the sun climbed higher, the coolness vanished. Heat spread across the field slowly at first, then heavily. Workers wrapped linen cloth around their heads while sweat darkened their clothing. Dust clung to damp skin almost immediately. This day would be spent repairing damaged storage buildings near the grain fields. The last flood season had weakened several mud brick walls, and repairs could not wait much longer. Grain stores protected entire villages from hunger during difficult months. Every family depended upon them. Kitty joined several other boys carrying baskets filled with wet clay and chopped straw toward the construction site. The mixture smelled earthy and sharp beneath the rising heat. Older workers shaped bricks carefully by hand while younger children hauled water and materials back and forth beneath the sun. The work moved slowly. Mud bricks required patience from beginning to end. Clay needed proper mixing. Walls needed careful stacking. Fresh bricks needed time to dry beneath open air. Nothing could truly be rushed without risking cracks or collapse later. Kitty's arms burned from carrying heavy loads, yet he noticed how calmly the older workers continued despite their exhaustion. One elderly builder moved more slowly than everyone else, but his hands placed each brick perfectly into position. He rarely spoke. Sweat rolled down the deep lines of his face while sunlight reflected from his shaved head. The younger boys sometimes became restless during these long hours. One of them, a thin child named Nebu, dropped a basket carelessly after stumbling over uneven ground. Wet clay spilled across the dust. For a brief moment frustration flashed across the boy's face. But the old builder simply knelt beside him and began gathering the clay quietly back into the basket. No anger, the old man murmured softly. Only more work. The lesson settled into the hot air beside them. Children learned patience partly because anger solved very little in a world shaped by physical labor and survival. Complaining did not cool the sun. Frustration did not lighten heavy loads. Most problems required steady endurance rather than sudden emotion. By midday the heat became almost unbearable. The workers rested beneath rough shade coverings stretched between wooden poles. Clay cups passed slowly from hand to hand filled with river water. Some workers ate dried figs or pieces of coarse bread while others simply closed their eyes to conserve energy. Kitty sat against the wall beside Nebu, both boys too tired to speak much. The ground radiated warmth upward through their thin clothing. Flies drifted lazily around baskets of grain nearby. Somewhere in the distance came the soft rhythmic knocking of tools from another workshop. The entire world seemed to move slowly beneath the crushing afternoon sun. Kitty watched his father sitting nearby with other laborers. Their bodies looked worn down by years of work. Thick hands scarred from tools. Bent shoulders. Faces darkened by endless exposure to sunlight and dust. Yet among them existed a quiet calmness too. These men understood hardship deeply, but they also understood survival. They had endured flood seasons, drought years, illness, poor harvests, and exhaustion before. Patience had become part of them long ago. Children growing up around such people absorbed that endurance naturally. After the short rest, work continued again. The afternoon passed through repetition. Carry clay. Stack bricks. Fetch water. Smooth walls. Repeat. Hour after hour beneath the endless brightness. For young people in ancient Egypt, much of life involved repetition so constant that patience almost became invisible. Tasks repeated daily until the body learned them without thought. Some children spent years doing nearly identical work before receiving greater responsibilities. Yet these routines also created stability. The same roads. The same fields. The same river. The same smells of bread and dust and smoke drifting through evening air. There was comfort hidden inside repetition too. Late that afternoon, dark clouds gathered far away beyond the western horizon. Rain rarely visited the region, and villagers paused briefly to watch the distant sky. Warm wind shifted across the fields carrying the faint smell of dry earth and distant moisture. Children stared upward with curiosity. Even small changes in weather felt important in such a predictable climate. But the clouds slowly drifted away without bringing rain. The villagers returned quietly to work. Patience again. Always patience. As sunset approached, the workers finally finished repairing the damaged walls. Fresh rows of drying bricks glowed softly orange beneath the lowering sun. Kitty flexed his aching fingers while helping clean scattered tools from the ground. His body felt heavy with exhaustion. Still, there remained evening tasks waiting at home. Animals needed feeding. Water jars needed refilling. Cooking fires needed preparing. Ancient Egyptian children rarely experienced long hours of idle rest. Family survival depended upon every person contributing whatever strength they could offer. Kitty walked back through the village beside his father while twilight spread across the sky. Dust rose softly around their feet. Women carried baskets of vegetables from nearby gardens. Fishermen unloaded nets near the docks while birds circled overhead searching for scraps. The smell of evening meals drifted everywhere now. Lentils cooking slowly. Fresh bread. Roasted onions. Fish drying above smoky fires. For a moment, despite the fatigue pressing through his body, Kitty felt peaceful. This was the hour he loved most. Not morning. Not midday. but this gentle space between labor and darkness. The village softened during twilight. Voices became quieter. The heat finally began releasing itself back into the sky. Children too young for serious work still chased one another through narrow paths while older workers sat resting outside their homes. Near the center of the village stood a small shrine decorated with faded paint and simple offerings left by local families. Oil lamps flickered softly there each evening. People passed respectfully, some pausing briefly in silence before continuing home. Religion in ancient Egypt flowed naturally through ordinary daily life. Children grew up surrounded by rituals, prayers, offerings, and stories about gods connected to rivers, harvests, death, and the movement of stars. These beliefs also taught patience. The gods themselves moved according to cycles. Flood seasons returned when they were meant to return. The sun rose when it was meant to rise. Human beings could only endure, prepare, and wait. That night Kitty's mother served a simple meal of bread, onions, lentils, and a small portion of dried fish shared among the family. The children ate quietly beside the dim lamp glow while warm air drifted through the doorway. Food rarely felt luxurious. But after long labor beneath the heat, even simple meals carried comfort. Kitty noticed how carefully his mother divided portions so everyone received enough. Parents in the ancient world constantly measured survival against limited supplies. Children learned restraint from watching this. They learned not to grab too quickly, not to waste, not to expect abundance. Patience existed even at the dinner mat. After eating, the younger children fell asleep quickly. Kitty remained awake beside his father outside the house while stars slowly appeared overhead. The older man repaired a wooden tool handle beneath the moonlight, smoothing rough edges with steady hands. Kitty watched silently for a long time before speaking. "Did you ever become tired of working?" he asked softly. His father continued smoothing the wood for several moments before answering. "Yes," he said quietly. The answer surprised the boy. Not because of the words themselves, but because of how calmly they were spoken. His father did not pretend strength meant never feeling exhausted. He simply continued after exhaustion arrived. The older man set the tool aside and looked toward the dark river beyond the village. "Everyone becomes tired," he said. "The river still moves." Kitty followed his gaze toward the distant water reflecting starlight through the darkness. The Nile never hurried. Never stopped. Never argued with the desert surrounding it. It simply continued. That was how many ancient people survived difficult lives. Not through sudden courage, but through steady movement forward one day at a time. The warm wind carried the scent of river reeds across the sleeping village. Somewhere nearby came the quiet sound of someone singing softly to a restless child. Palm leaves rustled overhead beneath the night sky. Kitty felt sleep pulling gently at him again. Tomorrow would arrive soon enough with more labor, more heat, more waiting. But for now, the village rested peacefully beside the eternal river, and the ancient world drifted quietly beneath the stars. Before the first light touched the eastern horizon, the village remained wrapped in a soft darkness that felt deep and ancient. The Nile moved quietly beside the sleeping homes, carrying cool air across the fields. A faint mist hovered low above the water, drifting slowly through clusters of reeds near the riverbank. Inside Kitty's house, the family still rested together on woven mats spread across the hard floor. The youngest child slept curled against her mother's side while the older boys shifted occasionally beneath thin linen cloths. The room smelled of warm clay, old straw, smoke from last night's cooking fire, and the faint earthy scent of damp river mud carried inside on sandals. For a few peaceful moments, the world seemed almost motionless. Then somewhere outside came the scrape of pottery against stone. A goat stirred awake. Footsteps crossed the dusty path beyond the doorway. Morning had begun again. The ancient world rose slowly from sleep, never suddenly, never loudly. Villages beside the Nile awakened in layers, like soft waves moving across still water. One lamp flickered to life. Then another. Doors opened quietly into the cool darkness while workers prepared themselves for another day shaped by labor and endurance. Kiti opened his eyes before his father touched his shoulder this time. His body already understood the rhythm of morning. Muscles stiff from yesterday's work protested as he sat upright. He rubbed dust from his face while listening to the familiar sounds gathering outside. His mother handed him a small piece of leftover bread. It was dry and slightly hard from the night air, but he ate it slowly without complaint. Hunger was common enough that children learned gratitude for simple food very early. Outside, the sky had begun turning pale gray above the eastern desert. Workers moved like quiet shadows through the village paths carrying baskets, ropes, and farming tools. Women balanced empty water jars against their hips while older children guided sleepy goats toward feeding areas beside the fields. The coolness before sunrise never lasted long. Everyone understood this. People worked quickly during early morning hours because once the sun climbed high above the desert, the heat would spread across the land like a heavy blanket. Kiti and his father walked toward the grain fields in silence. Their sandals pressed softly into the dusty road already marked by years of travel. Palm trees swayed gently overhead while birds called from hidden branches. The world smelled fresh for a brief little while. Wet earth. River reeds. Morning air before the dust fully rose. Along the irrigation canals, workers cleared weeds and mud beneath dim early light. Water moved slowly through narrow channels toward the farmland waiting beyond. The Nile made life possible here, but keeping that life flowing required constant effort from countless hands. Children learned quickly that survival depended upon maintenance. Walls cracked and needed repair. Canals clogged and needed clearing. Tools broke and needed mending. Nothing lasted forever without care. Patience grew naturally inside such a world. That morning Kiti would spend several hours helping an older farmer named Hori repair damaged canal edges near the far side of the fields. Hori walked with a slight limp from an old injury, and his movements carried the slow carefulness of someone long accustomed to pain. The old farmer rarely hurried anything. At first, younger boys often became impatient working beside him. Tasks that others finished quickly took Hori twice as long because he stopped constantly to check details. He examined soil carefully. He adjusted water flow little by little. He repaired weak spots thoroughly instead of covering them carelessly. But his canals rarely failed during flood season. And over time, children began understanding the wisdom hidden inside his slow methods. As the sun rose higher, Kiti knelt beside the canal pressing wet mud into crumbling edges while cool water slid around his hands. Dragonflies schemed low across the surface. Small frogs disappeared into reeds as workers approached. Hori used a wooden tool to smooth the repaired walls carefully. Too fast, he murmured whenever Kiti tried rushing. The boy slowed his movements again. Patience in ancient Egypt often came through correction repeated day after day. Older workers guided children not through long speeches but through constant small reminders. Slow your hands. Watch carefully. Do it again. Children shaped themselves around these rhythms until calmness became habit. By mid-morning, the sun burned brightly above the fields. Sweat gathered across Kiti's neck and shoulders while mud dried against his skin. The canal repair continued slowly beneath the growing heat. Nearby, Women harvested vegetables from small garden plots beside the water. Their woven baskets filled gradually with onions, beans, and greens protected from the harsh desert by careful irrigation. A little girl followed behind them gathering dropped vegetables one by one from the dirt. Even very young children carried responsibilities. Nobody stood entirely outside the work of survival. Across the fields came the distant sound of workers singing softly together while cutting reeds near the marshes. The rhythm of their song matched the rhythm of labor itself. Slow. Repeating. Steady. Kitty listened quietly while pressing more mud into place. The music drifted gently across the warm air, neither joyful nor sad. It simply existed beside the work like another natural sound of village life. Songs helped pass long hours. So did stories. So did silence. Children in the ancient world spent enormous portions of their lives simply waiting while work continued around them. Waiting beside markets while adults traded goods. Waiting for bread to finish baking. Waiting for river boats to arrive. Waiting for flood waters to retreat. Modern life often rushes toward speed, but ancient life moved according to slower forces that human beings could not control. The sun itself controlled much of the day. Once midday heat arrived fully, movement became difficult and exhausting. Workers sought patches of shade whenever possible. Animals rested quietly beneath trees. Even conversation slowed beneath the crushing brightness. Kitty and Hori finally stopped working when the old farmer wiped sweat from his brow and nodded toward a nearby sycamore tree. Enough for now. The shade beneath the tree felt cool compared to the blazing open fields. Kitty sat heavily upon the ground while Hori drank slowly from a clay water jar. Neither spoke for several minutes. The silence felt comfortable. Ancient Egyptian children grew used to silence in ways many people no longer understand. Long hours of physical labor left little energy for constant talking. Workers often shared companionship quietly through presence rather than conversation. Wind rustled softly through the sycamore leaves above them. The canal water flowed nearby with gentle steady sound. Far off in the distance, cattle lowed across the fields. Kitty leaned back against the tree trunk and closed his eyes for a moment. His entire body felt tired already, though much of the day still remained ahead. Hori watched the distant fields quietly before finally speaking. "When I was your age," the old man said softly, "I wanted every season to pass quickly." Kitty opened his eyes slightly but remained silent. "I wanted flood season to end. I wanted harvest to finish. I wanted to become strong faster." The old farmer smiled faintly while looking toward the river. "Then one day I noticed my hair had become gray." The words drifted into the warm afternoon air. Kitty studied the deep lines across Hori's face. Years of sunlight and labor had shaped every part of the old man's appearance. His hands looked rough as dried bark. His shoulders bent slightly from decades spent working beside the Nile. Yet there was gentleness in him too. A steadiness. Perhaps patience itself slowly softened people even while hardship aged them. After resting, they returned to work again beneath the blazing sky. Time passed slowly through repeated motion. Mud. Water. Clay. Sweat. Heat. Children learned endurance because there was no other choice. Still, the ancient world held moments of softness hidden between exhaustion. Late in the afternoon, clouds of white birds suddenly lifted from the marshes beside the river, rising together into the bright sky. Workers paused briefly to watch them circle above the reeds. The sight lasted only moments. Then labor continued once more. But small moments like these remained inside memory. The beauty of sunlight reflecting across water. The smell of fresh bread cooling beside a doorway. Cool mud between tired toes after long heat. The gentle relief of evening wind arriving at last. These simple comforts mattered deeply because life itself demanded so much patience. As sunset approached, Kitty and Hori finished repairing the final section of canal wall. The old farmer inspected the work carefully while river water flowed smoothly through the channel at last. "Good," he murmured quietly. Just one word. Yet Kitty felt pride warm inside his exhausted chest. Praise came rarely in the ancient world. Adults often expected children simply to work because survival required it. When approval arrived, even softly spoken approval carried great meaning. The two walked slowly back toward the village beneath deepening orange light. Shadows stretched long across the fields while warm evening wind moved through the palms. Workers everywhere began returning home carrying tools across weary shoulders. The entire landscape seemed to exhale after enduring the brutal afternoon heat. Near the docks, fishermen unloaded baskets of silverfish glistening faintly beneath the fading sunlight. Cats prowled nearby hoping for scraps. Children helped untangle nets while older men repaired damaged boats along the shore. The river smelled rich and earthy in the evening. Mud. Water plants. Fish scales. Wet wood warmed all day beneath the sun. Kitty paused briefly to watch one fisherman carefully stitching a torn net together beside the dock. The man's fingers moved slowly and patiently through the rope despite obvious exhaustion. Every knot mattered. A careless repair could cost food later. Children saw lessons like this everywhere around them. Carefulness mattered. Patience mattered. Steady hands mattered. Back in the village, cooking fires began glowing softly outside many homes. Thin smoke drifted upward into the darkening sky carrying comforting smells through the warm air. Bread baking. Lentils simmering. Onions roasting slowly. Families gathered together after another long day shaped by labor. Tiaa sat beside her mother again beneath the courtyard shade, weaving linen during the last light of evening. Her fingers moved almost automatically now after years spent learning the craft. Younger children nearby played quietly with reed dolls while older women exchanged soft conversations about harvests, illnesses, and river conditions. The weaving frames creaked gently in the evening breeze. Tiaa's back ached from sitting so long each day, yet she no longer complained about the discomfort. Like so many young people around her, she had learned to carry exhaustion quietly. Patience often meant accepting weariness without bitterness. When darkness fully settled across the village, oil lamps flickered warmly behind open doorways. Stars appeared overhead one by one above the silent desert. Kitty sat outside beside his family after supper while his younger brother slowly drifted asleep against his shoulder. The night air felt softer now. Cooler. The river moved unseen beyond the houses, though its quiet presence seemed to fill everything around them. An old storyteller from the village sat nearby surrounded by several children listening sleepily beneath the stars. His voice rose and fell gently while speaking of ancient travelers, hidden temples, and the endless journey of the sun across the sky. But even these stories carried calmness rather than excitement. The ancient world itself moved too slowly for constant drama. Most lives were built from ordinary days repeated again and again beneath heat, dust, work, and waiting. And inside those ordinary days, children slowly became adults. Not all at once. Not suddenly. But little by little through labor, patience, and endurance beside the eternal Nile River. Night settled deeply across the village beside the Nile. The last voices faded one by one into silence while oil lamps burned lower behind mud brick walls. Above the dark river, the stars stretched endlessly across the sky, pale and calm over the sleeping land. Kiti remained awake for a little while after the others had fallen asleep. His younger brother rested beside him, breathing softly through parted lips. Outside, warm wind moved through the reeds with a dry whispering sound. Somewhere farther down the village path, a baby cried briefly before becoming quiet again. The boy stared upward through the open doorway toward the stars. Ancient Egyptian nights often felt enormous. Without the bright fires and noise of modern life, darkness spread across the land in a deep and natural way. The desert beyond the green riverbanks disappeared almost completely beneath shadow. The Nile itself became only a dark ribbon reflecting faint silver moonlight. Children growing up in such places learned calmness from the night sky itself. There was so much stillness. So much waiting. So much quiet space for thought. Kiti listened to insects humming near the river and slowly felt his body relaxing after another exhausting day. His shoulders still ached from hauling mud beside the canals. His fingers felt stiff from gripping heavy baskets and smoothing wet clay. Yet there was comfort in the tiredness too. Work had ended for the day. No one demanded more from him now. At last, sleep slowly carried him away. Before dawn returned, cool wind drifted briefly across the village from the direction of the river. Palm leaves rustled gently overhead while darkness still covered the fields. The air held that rare freshness that existed only during the final quiet moments before sunrise. Then the village began waking once more. A cough from one house. Footsteps from another. The soft crackle of a fire being relit. Morning returned like it always did. Steady. Patient. Unavoidable. Kiti rose slowly from his mat while his mother prepared a simple morning meal. She moved carefully through the dim room, grinding grain beneath the soft flicker of the oil lamp. The heavy stone made a low scraping sound that many children in ancient Egypt heard almost every morning of their lives. Grain into flour. Flour into bread. Bread into survival. Simple routines repeated endlessly across generations. Outside, the eastern sky slowly brightened beyond the distant desert hills. Workers emerged from their homes carrying tools over tired shoulders. Donkeys shifted restlessly beside wooden carts while fishermen prepared boats near the docks. This morning the village would travel to nearby fields farther south where flax plants waited for harvesting. The walk would be long. The work even longer. Children often joined these journeys from an early age because harvesting required many hands. Even the smallest tasks mattered when entire communities depended upon successful crops. Kiti walked beside his father along the dusty road leading southward beside the river. Groups of workers moved together quietly through the cool early air. Some carried woven baskets. Others carried curved harvesting knives wrapped carefully in cloth. The Nile flowed beside them, dark blue beneath the growing dawn. Mist hovered low above the water. Birds lifted slowly from the reeds as the workers passed. For a little while, before the heat arrived, the world felt peaceful. Tiaa walked with another group farther ahead beside several women from the village. Her woven basket rested against her hip while loose strands of dark hair moved softly in the wind. She had harvested flax before many times. The work demanded patience more than strength. Plants needed pulling carefully from the earth to protect the fibers used later for linen weaving. Rushing damaged the stalks. Careless hands wasted valuable material. Every task in the ancient world seemed to teach the same quiet lesson. Slowly. Carefully. Again and again. As sunrise spread golden light across the fields, the workers finally reached the flax farms. Thin green stalks swayed gently beneath the morning breeze while irrigation channels reflected the brightening sky. Soon the labor began. Workers bent low across the fields, pulling flax from the soil in careful handfuls. Children gathered bundles and tied them together using strips of reed fiber. Dust rose around moving feet while insects buzzed heavily through the warm air. At first the morning remained pleasant enough. But slowly the heat returned. The sun climbed higher. The breeze weakened. Sweat gathered along every face and neck. Kitty worked steadily beside his father without speaking much. The repetitive motion almost became hypnotic after several hours. Pull. Shake loose dirt. Tie bundles. Carry them aside. Repeat. The fields filled with quiet rhythms of labor. Soft footsteps through dry soil. Plants rustling. Low murmured voices. Occasional laughter drifting briefly across the heat before fading again. Children learned patience partly because so much of ancient labor involved repeating simple movements for hours at a time. The body settled into rhythm. The mind drifted slowly alongside the work. There was little choice except acceptance. Mid-morning sunlight turned brighter and harsher across the fields. Workers wrapped linen cloth over their heads while searching for small patches of shade whenever possible. Water jars passed slowly between tired hands. Kitty's younger cousin, barely old enough for serious labor, sat resting beside a basket while rubbing sore fingers. "I am too slow," the boy whispered quietly. An older woman beside him smiled gently without stopping her work. "Everything begins slowly," she replied. The child watched her for a moment before returning to the flax plants again. In ancient Egypt, children spent much of their lives surrounded by adults who understood hardship deeply. Many older workers had endured famine years, illness, dangerous floods, and crushing exhaustion long before the younger generation arrived. Their patience came not from comfort, but from surviving difficulty over long stretches of time. Young people absorbed this endurance simply by living beside them. Near midday, the heat became almost unbearable. The fields shimmered beneath waves of bright air rising from the earth itself. Workers moved more slowly now, conserving strength carefully. The smell of warm soil and crushed plants filled the heavy air around them. Finally the overseers called for rest. The workers gathered beneath several sycamore trees near the irrigation channels. Some sat silently against the trunks while others soaked cloth in cool water and pressed it against tired faces. Kitty stretched his aching back carefully before lowering himself into the shade. The relief felt immediate. Even breathing became easier away from the direct sunlight. Nearby, Tiaa sat with several women weaving loose flax fibers together while resting. Their hands never seemed completely still. Ancient life rarely allowed full idleness during daylight hours. One elderly woman quietly hummed an old river song beneath her breath while working. The melody drifted softly through the shade. Simple. Slow. Comforting. Kitty closed his eyes while listening. The sounds around him blended together gently. Water moving through canals. Palm leaves rustling overhead. Workers breathing heavily after long labor. Faraway birds calling near the riverbank. For a moment, the entire world seemed suspended between exhaustion and peace. Then eventually the rest ended. Work resumed again beneath the afternoon sun. Children often learned one difficult truth very early in life. Rest never lasted forever. There was always more labor waiting. Still, human beings became skilled at finding small comforts inside hard days. Kitty enjoyed the feeling of cool canal mud between his toes whenever he crossed shallow water. Tiaa loved the smell of clean linen drying beneath sunlight after long hours weaving. Other children found happiness in evening meals, storytelling, or simply sitting quietly beside family after dark. Patience was easier when small moments of peace existed to carry people forward. As afternoon slowly passed, the harvested flax bundles grew into large stacks across the edge of the field. Workers moved carefully despite exhaustion because damaged fibers meant weaker cloth later. Ancient Egyptian linen was precious. It clothed workers, wrapped the dead, covered sleeping children at night, created sails for boats traveling along the Nile. So children handling flax learned responsibility along with patience. Toward evening, warm wind finally returned across the farmland. Workers visibly relaxed as cooler air touched their sweat-covered skin. Shadows stretched longer across the earth while sunlight softened into deeper gold. The hardest hours had passed. Kidi carried the final bundles toward waiting carts beside the road. His arms trembled slightly from fatigue now. Dust coated his legs nearly to the knees. Yet when he looked across the fields, he felt something close to pride. The harvest had gone well today. The village would have enough flax for weaving, enough cloth for trade, enough work to continue through future months. In ancient villages, survival itself often depended upon collective patience. Entire communities labored together season after season, each person contributing small pieces toward larger stability. No single child carried the burden alone. But every child carried part of it. As the workers finally began the long walk home, the sky glowed orange above the western desert. Birds circled low over the Nile while fishermen guided boats toward the docks. The evening world felt softer now. Slower. Almost sleepy beneath the fading light. Some children walked silently from exhaustion while others spoke quietly together about food waiting at home. Older workers carried tools across bent shoulders while dust drifted gently around their sandals. Kidi walked beside his father once more. For a long time neither spoke. Then the boy quietly asked, "Did you work this much when you were young?" His father looked ahead toward the distant village before answering. "Yes. Every day." The older man nodded slowly. "Most days." Kidi considered this while walking. It was strange sometimes to imagine adults once being children too. His father seemed as permanent as the river itself. Strong. Weathered. Always working. But once he had also carried heavy baskets beneath the same sun. Once he had also struggled with tired arms and sore feet. Perhaps patience traveled through generations that way. Passed silently from parent to child beside the eternal Nile. When the village finally appeared ahead of them, smoke already drifted upward from evening cooking fires. The smell of bread and roasted vegetables floated warmly through the air. Children too young for field labor played slowly beside the houses while older grandparents watched from shaded doorways. The sight filled Kidi with relief deeper than words. Home. Simple walls of mud brick. A woven sleeping mat. A meal shared beside dim lamplight. After long labor beneath endless heat, these ordinary comforts felt precious. Darkness slowly settled across the village again while families gathered together for the night. Oil lamps flickered softly against clay walls. Tired workers washed dust from their feet using cool river water carried home in jars. Kidi sat quietly outside after supper while stars appeared overhead one by one. The Nile moved unseen nearby beyond the dark houses. Steady. Patient. Endless. And all across ancient Egypt, countless other children rested beside the same river after long days of labor, slowly learning endurance through ordinary hardship beneath the ancient stars. The night deepened gently over the Nile Valley while the village settled into rest once again. Warm darkness wrapped itself around the mud brick homes, the quiet courtyards, the sleeping animals, and the narrow dusty paths worn smooth by countless years of footsteps. Kitty sat outside a little longer than usual that evening. His body felt heavy after the flax harvest. Every muscle carried the dull ache of long labor beneath the sun. Yet the coolness drifting from the river soothed him slowly. Nearby, his father repaired a fishing basket beneath the light of a small oil lamp while moths circled lazily through the glow. Neither of them spoke for some time. The silence between people in the ancient world was often comfortable. Families spent so many hours together working side by side that words became less necessary. Presence itself carried meaning. From somewhere farther down the village came the soft sound of singing. A mother, perhaps, trying to settle a restless child to sleep. The melody floated gently through the night air before fading again into stillness. Kitty watched the stars. He had never traveled far beyond the river villages. The world, as he understood it, was made of fields, boats, reeds, workshops, markets, and deserts stretching endlessly beyond the green land. Yet at night, beneath the enormous sky, even small villages felt connected to something vast and ancient. The stars above Egypt had watched over generations beyond counting. Over farmers waiting for flood waters. Over fishermen drifting through dark water. Over tired children falling asleep beside cooking fires after long days of work. The same stars remained while human lives passed quietly beneath them. Eventually Kitty lay down upon his mat inside the house beside his brothers. The room had become cooler now. A faint breeze slipped through the doorway carrying the scent of river mud and damp reeds. Sleep came quickly. But before dawn fully arrived, he woke once more to the familiar sounds of movement outside. Ancient Egyptian mornings never truly surprised anyone. Their arrival felt as dependable as the flow of the Nile itself. A grinding stone scraping grain. A donkey snorting softly. Water splashing into jars. Footsteps crossing packed earth. The village rose from sleep slowly beneath the fading stars. This day would be different from the previous ones. Instead of working in the fields, Kitty would travel with his uncle Painassi to the larger market settlement farther north along the river. The journey excited him quietly, though he tried not to show too much eagerness. Markets brought movement and change into otherwise repetitive village life. Boats arrived carrying goods from distant places. Merchants spoke with unfamiliar accents. Strange spices and fabrics appeared briefly before disappearing again down the river. Still, even these journeys involved labor rather than leisure. Painassi transported woven baskets, dried fish, and flax cloth to trade for grain tools and lamp oil. Kitty's job would be helping load and unload supplies throughout the day. Before sunrise, the two prepared a small river boat beside the docks. The wood creaked softly beneath their feet while dark water slapped gently against the sides. Mist drifted low across the Nile. The world felt hushed and gray. Painassi moved carefully while tying bundles beneath the boat canopy. He was quieter than most men in the village, with deep lines around his eyes from years spent squinting against sunlight reflecting from the river. "Steady hands," he murmured while showing Kitty how to secure the cargo ropes properly. The phrase reminded the boy of old Mena the fisherman. Slow hands. Steady hands. All across the ancient world, patience revealed itself through these repeated lessons. As dawn slowly brightened the eastern sky, the boat pushed away from shore. The river carried them northward through calm morning water. Kitty sat near the front of the boat watching sunlight spread slowly across the Nile Valley. Palm trees reflected in the river beside drifting reeds. White birds stood motionless in the shallows hunting fish. Farmers already moved through distant fields beside irrigation canals glimmering beneath the rising sun. The world seemed peaceful from the river. almost timeless. Painassi guided the boat quietly while warm morning wind filled the small linen sail above them. "You must learn patience on the Nile," he said after a long silence. Kitty looked toward him. "The river moves when it wishes. Fighting it only makes you tired." The boy nodded softly. It seemed every adult carried some version of the same wisdom. Patience was not simply a virtue in ancient Egypt. It was survival itself. The journey north took several hours. As the sun climbed higher, the coolness disappeared and heat spread once again across the river. Kitty helped adjust the sail while sweat gathered along his neck. Other boats passed nearby carrying grain, clay jars, vegetables, or stone from distant quarries. Some travelers rested beneath shaded coverings while others rode steadily through the bright water. Life along the Nile connected countless villages together through slow movement and trade. Children growing up near the river learned early that journeys required endurance. Boats could not always travel quickly. Winds changed unpredictably. Sandbanks delayed progress. Travelers waited often. So they learned to accept waiting calmly. By late morning the market settlement finally appeared ahead. Larger than Kitty's home village, it stretched along the riverbank beneath clusters of date palms and storage buildings. Docks crowded with boats lined the shore while smoke drifted upward from cooking fires and workshops. The sounds reached them even before they arrived fully. Voices bargaining. Animals braying. Wood striking stone. Children running through crowded paths. Yet even here, life still moved with the slow rhythm of the ancient world rather than frantic speed. The heat itself prevented constant rushing. Painassi guided the boat carefully into place beside the dock while Kitty jumped ashore carrying rope. Nearby workers unloaded baskets of figs from another vessel while fishermen sorted fresh catches beneath woven shade coverings. The market smelled rich and layered beneath the heat. Fish. Spices. Mud. Smoke. Sweat. Fresh bread. Animal dung drying in the sun. Kitty followed his uncle through the crowded paths carrying woven goods toward the trading area. Merchants sat beneath cloth awnings beside carefully arranged supplies while customers moved slowly between them. Some traders sold copper tools. Others offered linen cloth, oils, dried herbs, pottery, or jewelry. Kitty noticed one old scribe seated quietly beneath shade near the edge of the market. Scrolls rested beside him while he carefully painted symbols using a thin reed brush. His movements looked incredibly calm despite the busy world surrounding him. Young apprentices sat nearby grinding ink and preparing fresh papyrus. Even learning to write required years of patience. Most children in Egypt never became scribes. Writing remained difficult, expensive, and reserved mostly for specialized work. Yet those who did learn spent endless hours copying symbols repeatedly until their hands memorized every shape. Patience shaped every craft. While Painassi negotiated trades, Kitty waited beside stacked baskets in the shade. Waiting itself became part of work in ancient life. Waiting for customers. Waiting for boats. Waiting for measurements of grain. Waiting for the afternoon heat to weaken. Children learned stillness during these long pauses between labor. Kitty watched people move through the marketplace while flies drifted lazily through the warm air. A woman balanced water jars gracefully upon her shoulders while guiding two children through the crowd. An elderly fisherman repaired torn nets beneath a wall. Nearby, workers unloaded heavy stone blocks from a transport raft with slow coordinated effort. Nothing happened quickly. Everything required time, hands, and endurance. At midday the market slowed noticeably beneath the crushing heat. Many merchants rested beneath shade while others shared simple meals of bread, beans, and onions. Painasi and Kiti sat beside the river eating quietly while boats drifted nearby. The sunlight reflected brightly from the water, almost painful to look at directly. Kiti dipped his fingers into the Nile beside the dock and sighed softly at the coolness. "You worked hard," Painasi said suddenly. The boy looked up in surprise. Praise from adults came sparingly enough that even simple words stayed in memory. "I try," Kiti answered quietly. His uncle nodded. "That is enough." The words settled warmly inside him. Children in ancient Egypt rarely expected constant encouragement. Most learned through observation, correction, and repetition rather than praise. Yet because approval came rarely, it carried deep meaning when offered sincerely. After resting, the work resumed. Painasi traded the final bundles of flax cloth for oil jars and bronze fishing hooks. Kiti helped carry supplies back toward the docks while afternoon shadows slowly lengthened across the settlement. The return journey began late in the day beneath softer golden light. The boat drifted southward now with slower movement against the river current. Painasi rowed steadily while Kiti rested beneath the canopy, exhausted from heat and labor. The Nile glowed orange beneath the setting sun. Birds crossed overhead in dark shapes against the bright sky. Along the riverbanks, farmers returned home through dusty fields while smoke from evening fires rose gently into the calm air. Everything around them seemed wrapped in tired peacefulness. Kiti watched the passing shore quietly. Children bathed near the river edge while mothers washed clothing nearby. Fishermen secured boats for the night. Workers carried tools across weary shoulders through narrow village paths. All along the Nile, ordinary lives repeated the same patient rhythms. Day after day. Season after season. Generation after generation. The ancient world endured not because life was easy, but because people learned to continue steadily through hardship. By the time Kiti and Painasi reached home, darkness had already begun settling across the village. Oil lamps flickered softly near doorways while cooking fires filled the air with comforting smells. Kiti stepped from the boat with tired legs. His mother greeted him quietly while taking one of the oil jars from his hands. Inside the house, supper waited. Warm bread. Lentils. A few dried dates from the market. Simple food after a long day. As the family gathered together beneath dim lamplight, Kiti felt sleep pulling heavily at him already. Outside, the Nile moved silently through the darkness beyond the village. Steady. Ancient. Patient as always beneath the stars. Long after the village lamps had dimmed into darkness, the Nile continued its slow journey through the sleeping land. Water brushed softly against the riverbanks beneath the stars while reeds swayed gently in the warm night wind. Far beyond the fertile valley, the desert rested in silence beneath pale moonlight, endless and still. Inside the small house, Kiti slept deeply after the long journey to the market settlement. His body felt heavy with exhaustion. Dreams drifted slowly through his mind like river water moving through reeds. Fragments of the crowded docks returned to him. The smell of spices beneath the heat. Boats rocking gently beside wooden posts. The calm face of the old scribe painting careful symbols beneath the shade. Even in sleep, the ancient world moved slowly. Near dawn, the village remained quiet except for the soft sounds of waking animals and distant water birds calling from the marshes. A cool breeze slipped through the doorway carrying the scent of wet mud and river plants into the room. Kiti opened his eyes before sunrise. For a moment he remained still, listening. The world before dawn always felt different from the rest of the day. Softer. More peaceful. The heat had not yet arrived. The noise of labor had not yet begun. The Nile Valley rested in a rare space between darkness and work. His mother already knelt beside the grinding stone preparing flour for bread. The rhythmic scraping filled the dim room gently. Back and forth. Slow and steady. A sound repeated every morning across thousands of homes throughout ancient Egypt. Kitty rose quietly and stepped outside into the cool air. The sky above the eastern horizon had begun turning pale silver. Palm trees stood motionless against the fading stars while mist drifted low above the river. Several older fishermen already prepared their boats nearby. Their movements carried the calm familiarity of people repeating tasks learned long ago in childhood. Untangle nets. Check rope knots. Load baskets. Push into the current. Children growing up near the Nile often learned entire routines before they fully understood the reasons behind them. Repetition shaped memory. The body remembered what the mind still struggled to explain. This morning Kitty would spend time helping the fishermen along the docks instead of working in the fields. Flood season would arrive within the coming months, and many boats required repair before river conditions changed. As the first sunlight spread slowly across the village, workers gathered near the riverbank carrying tools and bundles of rope. The air smelled of wet wood, fish scales, and damp reeds warming beneath the rising sun. Old Mena sat cross-legged beside a half-finished fishing net while several boys gathered around him. "Bring the rope carefully," he murmured to Kitty. The boy obeyed immediately. Mena's hands fascinated him. Even after decades of labor, the old fisherman tied knots with smooth, precise movements that never seemed hurried. His fingers moved slowly, yet they rarely made mistakes. Patience created skill. And skill created survival. Kitty sat beside him helping untangle damaged rope while nearby workers repaired cracked boat planks using wooden pegs and sticky resin warmed over small fires. The morning passed quietly beside the docks. Birds glided low over the water searching for fish. Boats drifted gently against the shore. Warm sunlight slowly spread across the river. At times the fishermen spoke softly among themselves about water levels, weather signs, and fish movements farther south. But long stretches passed where only the sounds of labor filled the air. Rope tightening. Wood creaking. Knives scraping against planks. Water moving softly nearby. Children in the ancient world became comfortable with repetition because so much of life unfolded through repeated motion and familiar sounds. Days often resembled one another closely. The same roads. The same tools. The same heat rising across the fields. Yet within those repetitions existed subtle changes that people learned to notice carefully. The smell of flood water arriving early. Bird migrations shifting. Crops growing stronger or weaker than usual. Patience sharpened observation. Mena handed Kitty part of the net. "Not too tight," he said gently. Kitty adjusted his fingers. The old fisherman nodded faintly. "You cannot force rope to obey." The lesson sounded simple, yet the boy understood there was more inside those words. Many things in life resisted force. River currents. Seasons. Growing crops. Healing illness. Even people themselves. Ancient Egyptian children slowly learned which parts of life demanded effort and which parts demanded acceptance. By mid-morning the sun had grown hotter. Light reflected brightly from the Nile until the water almost seemed made of hammered bronze. Sweat darkened the workers' linen clothing while flies gathered near baskets of fish drying beside the shore. A younger boy nearby became frustrated while trying unsuccessfully to repair part of a torn net. The rope tangled repeatedly around his fingers until he finally sighed loudly and threw it down beside him. Mena watched quietly for a moment. Then he picked up the rope again and placed it gently back into the child's hands. "Again," he said softly. "No anger." No scolding. Simply again. Patience in the ancient world often meant repeating difficult tasks many times without expecting quick mastery. The younger boy tried once more. This time slower. Nearby, Kitty continued tying knots carefully while listening to the sounds of the river. The steady rhythm calmed him. Some days beside the Nile felt almost peaceful despite the labor involved. Perhaps because the river itself never appeared rushed. The water flowed steadily south to north, unconcerned with human frustration or exhaustion. Children growing up beside it absorbed something of that calm movement into themselves over time. Near noon, the fishermen paused to eat beneath woven shade coverings stretched beside the docks. The meal was simple. Bread, dried fish, a few olives traded from northern merchants. Water carried in cool clay jars from the river. Kitty sat beside Mena while warm wind drifted across the shore carrying the smell of reeds and sunlight-heated mud. For a while they ate silently. Then the old fisherman pointed toward the far riverbank where several children guided goats along a narrow path. When I was young, Mena said quietly, I wanted life to become easier. Kitty listened carefully. But every year brought different burdens. The old man smiled faintly while watching the current move past them. So I learned something else instead. What? Kitty asked softly. Mena looked toward him. How to carry difficult things without fighting them. The words stayed with the boy long after the meal ended. Ancient people rarely expected life to become comfortable for very long. Floods failed. Crops spoiled. Illness arrived without warning. Bodies aged beneath endless labor. Yet many still found ways to endure peacefully. Not because suffering disappeared, but because patience softened resistance to hardship itself. After the meal, work resumed again beneath the afternoon heat. Several fishermen carried boats farther onto shore for repairs while others cleaned nets tangled with river weeds. Kitty helped scrape old resin from cracked planks using a stone blade. The work required concentration. Too much pressure damaged the wood. Too little left weak spots behind. Children learned balance through such tasks. Strength alone rarely solved problems. Carefulness mattered equally. As the hottest hours arrived, the village grew quieter beneath the blazing sun. Even the animals rested in shade whenever possible. Dogs slept beside walls with tongues hanging from the heat. Donkeys stood motionless near water troughs flicking flies away with tired tails. The entire world seemed slower in afternoon heat. Breathing slowed. Movement slowed. Voices softened. Kitty wiped sweat from his forehead while continuing the repair work beside Mena. His hands had grown stronger over recent years. Tasks that once exhausted him completely now felt manageable, though never easy. Patience changed the body gradually. Not all at once. Little by little through repetition. Toward late afternoon, dark clouds appeared faintly along the distant horizon beyond the western desert. The fishermen noticed immediately. Wind tonight, one murmured. The air itself seemed to shift slightly. Palm leaves rustled more strongly while cooler currents drifted briefly across the river. Kitty looked toward the sky with quiet curiosity. Storms were rare here, but strong winds sometimes swept through the valley carrying dust and rough water along the Nile. The fishermen worked more quickly now, securing boats carefully against the shore. Again patience revealed itself not as passivity, but preparedness. Ancient people survived because they learned to anticipate change calmly instead of panicking when it arrived. By sunset the wind had strengthened noticeably. Dust moved across the village paths in thin swirling clouds while river water rippled beneath darkening skies. Families secured loose baskets and coverings outside their homes. Kitty helped his father tie extra rope around storage jars near the house wall. The air smelled different now. Dry. Electric somehow. Full of distant desert dust. As darkness settled, the wind continued rising steadily through the Nile Valley. Palm trees bent softly while reeds hissed beside the riverbank. Inside the house, the family gathered close around the small oil lamp while dust whispered against the outer walls. The younger children seemed nervous. Kitty's mother soothed them gently while continuing to weave flax fibers beside the dim light. Her calmness itself carried comfort. Adults in ancient Egypt often hid their worries carefully because fear spread quickly in difficult environments. Children learned steadiness partly from watching older people remain calm during uncertain moments. Outside, the wind moved stronger through the village now. Boats knocked softly against wooden docks. Loose sand brushed across the roads. The Nile rippled beneath the dark sky. Yet inside the small house, warmth remained. Bread baked earlier still carried a faint comforting smell. The lamp flickered softly against the mud walls. Family members rested shoulder to shoulder in the close crowded room. Hardship often created closeness too. People depended upon one another deeply. Before sleep, Kitty listened to the storm wind moving across the ancient land beyond the village. Somewhere far out in the darkness, desert sands shifted beneath the night sky while the eternal river continued its patient journey northward. And beside that river, children drifted slowly into sleep after another long day learning endurance through ordinary life in the ancient world. The wind continued through much of the night, moving across the Nile Valley with a long steady breath. Dust brushed softly against the mud brick walls while palm trees swayed under the dark sky. Boats tied beside the docks rocked gently against their ropes, creaking now and then in the darkness. Inside the house, Kitty woke briefly to the sound of the wind passing through the village paths. For a few sleepy moments he listened without moving. The younger children rested close together beside their mother. His father slept near the doorway with one arm beneath his head. The oil lamp had burned out long ago, leaving only faint moonlight spilling softly across the floor. The room felt warm but safe. Outside, the ancient world shifted and stirred beneath the restless sky, but inside the little home, family remained gathered together against the night. Kitty closed his eyes again. The sound of the wind slowly blended with dreams. By dawn the storm had mostly passed. The air smelled different when the village awakened. Cooler. Fresher somehow. Thin layers of fine desert dust covered the roads, rooftops, and doorways. Palm leaves lay scattered beside the irrigation channels while reeds along the riverbanks bent heavily from the night winds. Workers stepped outside quietly to inspect the damage. Most storms in the Nile Valley passed without great destruction, but even small changes demanded attention. Loose roofing needed repairing. Boats needed checking. Irrigation channels sometimes became clogged with sand after strong winds. Ancient life required constant maintenance because nature itself never truly rested. Kitty followed his father toward the river after eating a small piece of bread. The morning light spread pale gold across the village while cool air still lingered from the storm. At the docks, fishermen already moved between the boats inspecting ropes and wooden hulls. Some nets had tangled during the wind. One smaller boat had partially drifted loose from its post during the night. Mena sat beside it calmly repairing a cracked oar. "You see," the old fisherman said softly as Kitty approached. "The river always asks for more work." The boy smiled faintly. It was true. No matter how carefully people prepared, there was always another repair waiting somewhere. Another task unfinished. Another difficulty arriving quietly over time. Patience meant accepting this reality without bitterness. Kitty spent the early morning helping clear sand and broken reeds from the dock area. The work felt endless at times. Every basket of debris removed revealed more scattered nearby. Still, the workers continued steadily. Nobody rushed. Nobody complained loudly. The storm had passed. Now came the work afterward. Along the Nile, children learned that hardship often arrived in waves. One difficult thing ended and another began. Flood seasons followed droughts. Illness followed harvests. Repair work followed storms. Life was not arranged neatly into easy and difficult periods. Everything mixed together. Yet people still found moments of peace inside ordinary days. As the sun rose higher, warm light reflected from puddles left beside the riverbank where waves had splashed ashore during the wind. Birds returned gradually to the reeds. Fishermen tested repaired ropes while women carried fresh water jars through the village paths. The world slowly settled back into its familiar rhythm. Near mid-morning, a group of workers arrived from a nearby estate carrying damaged grain baskets that needed repair. Several older boys and younger children gathered beneath a shaded courtyard to help weave new reed supports into the broken frames. Kitty joined them. The courtyard smelled of dry reeds, dust, and sun-warmed clay walls. Thin beams of sunlight filtered through woven coverings overhead while workers sat cross-legged beside piles of repair materials. An elderly basket maker named Jiddu supervised the work quietly. His hands moved with incredible patience despite their age. Each reed bent carefully into place. Each knot tightened slowly and correctly. Young workers often became frustrated learning basket weaving because mistakes ruined hours of effort very quickly. Reeds cracked. Patterns slipped unevenly. Frames collapsed if woven too loosely. Jiddu rarely scolded anyone. Instead, whenever a child made a mistake, he simply handed the materials back and said gently, "Again." The same lesson repeated everywhere. Again. 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 Patience in ancient Egypt was built through repetition more than instruction. Kitty worked carefully beside another boy named Nebu, who still struggled with weaving tight corners properly. "My fingers hurt," Nebu muttered quietly while trying to bend a stiff reed into place. Jiddu overheard him but did not laugh. "Yes," the old man replied softly. "That is how hands learn." The courtyard became quiet again except for the sounds of weaving. Reeds rubbing together. Hands moving slowly. Occasional sighs from tired workers. Outside, sunlight brightened across the village while heat gradually returned after the cool morning. Kitty noticed how calm Jiddu remained no matter how slowly the repairs progressed. The old craftsman never seemed impatient with unfinished work. Perhaps age changed people this way. Perhaps after enough seasons beside the Nile, human beings understood that nearly everything worthwhile required time. By midday the heat settled heavily across the courtyard. Workers rested briefly beneath the shade while clay water jars passed from hand to hand. Kitty leaned against the wall and stretched his sore fingers. Tiny cuts lined his hands from reeds scraping against his skin during the morning labor. Nearby, Nebu closed his eyes tiredly. "Do you think life becomes easier when we are older?" he asked softly. Kitty considered the question. He looked toward Jiddu carefully repairing another basket frame with slow practiced movements. Then toward fishermen hauling nets beside the river. Then toward his father carrying heavy grain sacks near the storage buildings. The adults still looked tired. Still worked constantly. Still carried burdens each day beneath the sun. "I do not know," Kitty answered honestly. Nebu sighed quietly. For a while neither boy spoke. Then Jiddu looked up from his work. "Your back grows stronger," he said gently. The boys turned toward him. And your heart becomes quieter. The old man returned to weaving after that, leaving the words resting softly in the warm air between them. Kitty thought about them for a long time. Perhaps patience was not about making hardship disappear. Perhaps it changed the person carrying the hardship instead. The afternoon passed slowly through careful labor. Basket after basket took shape beneath tired hands while sunlight shifted across the courtyard floor. Outside, the village continued its endless rhythms. Donkeys carried water jars through dusty paths. Women baked bread beside clay ovens. Children too young for serious labor played quietly near shaded walls. Fishermen repaired boats. Farmers checked irrigation channels after the storm. Everywhere people moved steadily through ordinary work beneath the Nile sun. Toward evening, the repaired baskets were finally stacked neatly beside the wall. Kitty flexed his stiff fingers while Jiddu inspected the finished work carefully. The old craftsman paused beside one basket woven by Kitty. He pressed gently against the frame, testing its strength. Then he nodded once. Strong enough. The small gesture filled the boy with quiet pride. In the ancient world, approval often arrived silently. No grand praise. No celebration. Just trust slowly earned through steady work. As sunset approached, the heat finally loosened its grip on the land again. Evening wind drifted through the village carrying the smell of river water and cooking fires. Kitty walked home slowly through the dusty paths. His body ached. His eyes felt heavy. Yet the familiar sights around him brought comfort. Palm shadows stretching long across the road. Smoke rising softly into the orange sky. Children laughing quietly near the wells. The Nile glowing gold beyond the houses. At home, his mother prepared lentils and fresh bread while his younger sister slept beside the wall wrapped in linen cloth. The room smelled warm and peaceful after the long day outside. Kitty sat near the doorway watching twilight settle across the village. His father entered carrying a repaired tool handle over one shoulder. Dust covered his clothing from the day's labor. For a while the family ate quietly together beneath the soft lamp glow. Then his mother spoke gently about the coming flood season. Farmers along nearby villages had begun noticing slight changes in the river already. Everyone listened carefully. Flood season shaped everything. Too little water brought hunger. Too much water destroyed homes and fields. The Nile gave life, but it also demanded patience from those living beside it. After supper, darkness spread slowly across the valley. One by one the village sounds faded into nighttime stillness again. Kitty stepped outside briefly before sleep. The air felt calm after the storm. Above him, the stars stretched endlessly over the ancient land. The same stars watched over farmers resting beside irrigation canals far away. Over fishermen drifting quietly through dark water. Over tired children falling asleep after long days of labor. Kitty listened to the soft movement of the river nearby. Steady. Patient. Always moving forward through the night. The river moved quietly beneath the stars while the village rested in darkness once again. Warm air drifted gently through the Nile Valley carrying the scent of damp earth, palm bark, and cooling stone. The storm dust from the night before had settled now, leaving the road soft and pale beneath moonlight. Kitty stood outside for only a little while before sleep began pulling at him again. From nearby houses came the faint sounds of families settling for the night. Someone quietly swept sand from a doorway. A tired mother hummed softly while rocking a restless child. Somewhere beyond the fields, dogs barked briefly before silence returned. The ancient world never became completely still. Even in darkness, life breathed softly beside the Nile. At last Kitty returned inside and lay upon his reed mat beside his brothers. His muscles relaxed slowly into the familiar ache of exhaustion. The smell of fresh bread still lingered faintly in the room. Before long, sleep carried him gently away. Morning arrived softly, as it always did. First came the distant calls of river birds. Then footsteps outside. Then the grinding stone moving steadily beneath his mother's hands. The eastern horizon slowly brightened beyond the desert while cool dawn air drifted through the village. Kitty opened his eyes reluctantly. His body still felt tired from the previous day's work repairing baskets. Tiny cuts across his fingers had stiffened overnight. He flexed them carefully while sitting upright. Ancient Egyptian children often woke tired. Rest helped, but it rarely erased exhaustion completely. Life beside the Nile demanded too much labor for bodies ever to feel entirely restored. Still, people rose each morning because survival allowed no true pause. Today the village prepared for one of its regular journeys into the reed marshes near the river's edge. Reeds were needed constantly throughout daily life. For baskets. For sleeping mats. For roof coverings. For sandals. For writing brushes. Nothing went unused in the ancient world. Shortly after sunrise, groups of workers headed toward the marshlands carrying cutting knives and rope. The path curved beside irrigation canals where green plants grew thick near the water. The air smelled rich there. Wet mud. River plants. Morning dew warming beneath sunlight. Kitty walked beside Tiaa for part of the journey while older workers moved ahead carrying woven baskets. The girl balanced a small knife carefully against her hip. "You are quiet today," she said softly. Kitty shrugged slightly. "Tired?" Tiaa smiled faintly. "Everyone is tired." There was no bitterness in her voice. Only simple truth. The children of ancient Egypt grew up understanding weariness as a normal part of life. Fatigue did not mean failure. It simply belonged to existence the way heat belonged to summer afternoons. The marshes appeared ahead in long stretches of green reeds swaying beside the Nile. Water shimmered between narrow pathways while insects buzzed heavily through the warm air. Workers spread out carefully through the marshland. Some cut tall reeds near the water's edge. Others bundled harvested stalks together using strips of flax fiber. Children carried smaller bundles back toward dry ground where carts waited. The work required balance and patience. Mud shifted beneath every step. Sharp reeds scraped against exposed skin. Hidden pools of water sometimes reached suddenly to the knees. Kitty moved slowly at first, careful not to lose footing while carrying bundles toward shore. Nearby, Tiaa cut reeds beside several women from the village. Their hands moved with practiced rhythm beneath the morning sunlight. Slice. Gather. Tie. Repeat. The marshes hummed softly with life all around them. Dragonflies schemed over the water. Frogs disappeared beneath reeds. Birds called from hidden nests nearby. Ancient Egyptian children spent much of their lives outdoors surrounded by natural rhythms. They learned weather from the feel of wind. Learned flood seasons from the smell of river water. Learned time itself through sunlight moving across fields and marshes. Patience came partly from living so closely beside nature, where nothing truly hurried. As the morning passed, the heat gradually strengthened again. Sweat gathered along workers' necks while mud clung heavily to their feet. Kitty carried another bundle toward shore when he noticed an older woman nearby struggling with a heavy stack of reeds balanced awkwardly against her shoulder. Without speaking, he moved to help steady the load. The woman smiled tiredly. "You are becoming strong," she murmured softly. The words stayed with him quietly. Children in the ancient world often measured growth not through birthdays or celebrations, but through usefulness. Carrying heavier loads. Working longer hours. Earning trust from adults. Strength itself became a form of belonging. By midday the marshes shimmered beneath crushing sunlight. Workers sought shade wherever they could find it along the riverbank. Kitty sat beneath a palm tree beside Tiaa and several others while they shared a simple meal. Bread softened with water. A few dried figs. Cool river water from clay jars. Nothing luxurious. Yet after hours in the marsh heat, even small meals felt comforting. The group rested mostly in silence while wind moved softly through the reeds nearby. Tiaa dipped her feet into the shallow river water and sighed quietly. My mother says flood season may arrive early this year, she said after a while. Several older workers nearby exchanged thoughtful looks. The Nile's floods shaped every aspect of Egyptian life. Villages watched the river carefully for signs of change. Early floods could destroy unprepared storage areas or damage crops still growing near the banks. But floods also brought fertile soil necessary for survival. Children learned early that many important things carried both danger and blessing together. Kitty looked out across the water. The Nile appeared calm today. Almost sleepy beneath the bright sky. Yet somewhere far south, rains had already begun feeding the great river long before the flood waters reached these northern villages. Patience often meant waiting for distant events no one could see directly. After resting, the workers returned to labor once more. The afternoon moved slowly through heavy heat. Reeds piled higher beside the carts while tired bodies bent and lifted endlessly beneath the sun. Kitty's shoulders burned from carrying wet bundles repeatedly across the marsh paths. Mud dried hard against his legs. Insects buzzed constantly around his face. At times the work felt endless. But around him the older workers simply continued steadily. No rushing. No panic. Only quiet endurance. Ancient children learned patience partly because adults modeled it constantly through ordinary behavior. Even during exhausting labor, most workers conserved energy carefully rather than wasting it on anger or complaint. Late in the afternoon, dark birds circled above the marshes while shadows slowly lengthened across the water. Cooler wind finally drifted through the reeds, bringing relief to the exhausted workers. The day's harvest was nearly complete. Kitty helped load the final reed bundles onto wooden carts while nearby children rinsed mud from their legs beside the riverbank. For a few moments laughter drifted softly through the air as younger boys splashed water at one another despite their fatigue. Even hard lives contain small moments of play. Small moments of lightness. Human beings always searched for them. The return walk toward the village felt slow and heavy after such a long day. Workers moved quietly beneath the fading sunlight while carts creaked along the dusty road. The sky glowed deep orange above the Nile. Palm shadows stretched across the fields. Smoke from evening fires had already begun rising ahead in the distance. Kitty walked beside his father carrying a bundle of fresh reeds over one shoulder. His arms trembled slightly from exhaustion now. After a long silence, his father spoke quietly. When I was young, I thought strength meant never becoming tired. Kitty listened carefully. But real strength, the older man continued, is continuing after tiredness arrives. The words settled softly into the evening air between them. Kitty thought about all the adults around him. Men are repairing nets with worn hands. Jiddu patiently weaving baskets despite his age. His mother grinding grain before sunrise every morning. Tiaa weaving linen through endless afternoons. None of them avoided hardship. They simply carried it quietly. Perhaps that was the patience ancient Egypt taught its children most deeply. Not waiting without action, but enduring gently through long difficult seasons of ordinary life. When the village finally appeared ahead, relief spread through the weary workers almost like cool water. Home waited there. Cooking fires. Shade. Rest. Families gathering together after another exhausting day beside the Nile. That evening, after supper, Kitty sat outside near the doorway while warm darkness slowly covered the village. The air smelled of smoke and fresh-cut reeds drying nearby. Children's voices faded one by one as sleep overtook the younger families. Above everything, the stars returned again. Ancient. Silent. Patient beyond human understanding. Kitty listened to the soft movement of the river somewhere beyond the houses and fields. The Nile continued flowing northward through the darkness exactly as it had long before he was born. And beside that endless river, another ordinary day had quietly shaped the heart of a child learning patience through hardship in the ancient world. The village slept beneath a sky filled with pale stars while the Nile moved quietly through the darkness beyond the fields. Warm night air drifted softly between the mud brick homes carrying the scent of smoke, river water, and drying reeds stacked beside walls after the long day's harvest. Inside the small house, Kitty rested deeply at first, exhausted from carrying heavy bundles through the marshes. His arms still ached even in sleep. Tiny scratches from sharp reeds burned faintly across his skin. Yet sometime during the deepest part of the night, he woke. For a moment he did not know why. Then he heard it. Rain. Very soft at first. A faint tapping against the roof coverings above. Rain was uncommon enough in this part of Egypt that even light showers felt strange and almost magical. Kitty remained still, listening carefully while the tiny sounds continued overhead. His younger sister shifted beside their mother but did not wake. Outside, the village remained quiet beneath the gentle rain. The smell of wet dust drifted through the doorway. Fresh. Cool. Earthy in a way the air rarely smelled beside the Nile. Kitty closed his eyes again while listening to the soft rhythm above him. The sound relaxed him deeply. It blended with the distant movement of the river and the breathing of his sleeping family until the whole world seemed wrapped in calm darkness. By dawn the rain had already passed. The village awakened beneath pale gray skies and cool morning air. Small puddles shimmered along the dusty paths while wet palm leaves glistened softly in the early light. Children stepped outside curiously. Adults inspected roofs and storage areas. The air itself felt different after the rain. Lighter somehow. More alive. Kitty stood near the doorway breathing deeply while cool wind touched his face. The ground beneath his feet felt damp instead of dry and dusty. His father looked toward the sky thoughtfully. Good for the gardens, he murmured. Even brief rain carried value in such a hot land. Ancient Egyptians watched the natural world carefully because survival depended upon noticing changes others might ignore. The smell of river water. The movement of birds. The shape of clouds above distant horizons. Children learned observation as naturally as walking. This morning many villagers would spend time checking small vegetable gardens and repairing areas where the rain had loosened mud walls near irrigation channels. Kitty followed his mother toward the family's small garden plot beside the canal beyond the village houses. Onion plants and beans grew there in neat rows protected carefully from harsh sun and dry soil. The earth smelled rich after the rain. Wet mud clung softly beneath their sandals. Water droplets rested upon broad green leaves. Kitty knelt beside the canal helping clear debris washed into the narrow water channels overnight. Tiny branches, leaves, and reeds had gathered against the edges during the rain. His mother worked quietly beside him, pulling weeds from the softened soil. For a long while neither spoke. The morning itself felt peaceful enough without words. Birds moved through the palm trees nearby. Cool wind brushed gently across the fields. The Nile reflected pale silver beneath the cloudy sky. Ancient Egyptian life contained endless labor, yet some tasks carried calmness within them. Garden work felt softer than hauling bricks or cutting reeds. The movements were slower, more careful, almost gentle. Children learned patience through these quieter tasks too. Plants could not be rushed. Seeds needed time beneath the soil. Watering required regular attention over many days. Growth arrived slowly and silently. Kitty's mother loosened soil carefully around a small onion plant before speaking softly. When I was little, I wanted everything immediately. Kitty smiled faintly. What changed? She looked across the garden thoughtfully. The earth does not hurry for anyone. The boy considered her words while pressing mud back along the canal edge. Everywhere around him adults seemed to repeat the same lesson in different forms. The river does not hurry. The earth does not hurry. Rope does not obey force. Again. 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 Patience shaped nearly every part of ancient life. As the morning continued, sunlight gradually pushed through the clouds. Steam rose softly from wet ground while workers emerged from homes carrying tools toward fields and workshops once more. The brief coolness after the rain slowly disappeared. Heat returned. It always returned. Kitty and his mother finished tending the garden before carrying baskets of onions back toward the village. Along the paths, other families repaired small storm damage from the night rain. One elderly man patched roof coverings using fresh reeds. Children carried mud for wall repairs. Women spread damp grain beneath sunlight to dry properly again. Life beside the Nile never truly paused. Even after unusual weather, work simply changed direction. Near the center of the village, several boys gathered around an old storyteller named Beck standing beneath a sycamore tree. His beard had grown thin and white with age, and his back bent heavily now, yet children still listened carefully whenever he spoke. Kitty paused nearby while carrying the onion basket. Beck held a small carved wooden figure in one hand while speaking slowly. When I was young, the old storyteller said, I believed patience meant sitting still and waiting. The children watched him quietly. But the river taught me otherwise. Warm wind moved softly through the tree leaves overhead. Beck smiled faintly. The Nile never stops moving. Kitty listened closely now. It moves slowly, the old man continued. But it always continues forward. The children remained silent. Even at their young ages, they understood the truth inside those words. Ancient patience was not laziness. Not surrender. It was steady endurance. Movement without panic. Continuing despite exhaustion. Beck dismissed the children gently after finishing his story. Kitty carried the basket home feeling thoughtful. The village around him moved through its familiar rhythms once more. Pottery wheels spinning slowly inside workshops. Women grinding grain. Fishermen untangling nets. Workers repairing walls softened by the rain. Everywhere hands moved steadily through necessary tasks. At midday the heat grew strong again despite the earlier rain. Sunlight reflected brightly from damp ground while flies gathered near cooking areas and storage buildings. Kitty spent the afternoon helping his father repair part of the family roof where moisture had loosened several reed bundles. They climbed carefully onto the flat roof carrying fresh reeds tied together with flax cord. The mud surface felt warm beneath their feet while village sounds drifted upward around them. From above, Kitty could see much of the Nile Valley stretching beyond the houses. Green fields beside winding canals. Palm trees swaying gently. The river glimmering beneath sunlight farther away. And beyond everything, the desert waiting silently beyond a fertile land. The contrast always amazed him. Life and dryness standing side by side. Ancient Egyptians understood deeply how fragile comfort could be. Without the Nile's waters, these villages would disappear beneath desert heat very quickly. Perhaps that understanding made people more patient too. They knew survival itself depended upon careful balance maintained over time. Kitty handed reed bundles to his father while the older man secured them carefully into place. "Not too loose," his father murmured. The same carefulness again. The same slow precision repeated across countless ordinary tasks. The afternoon passed quietly beneath the sun. Sweat rolled down Kitty's back while warm wind carried the smell of wet earth slowly drying after the rain. Far below in the village paths, younger children chased one another through shallow puddles left from the night shower. Their laughter drifted softly upward. Even simple joys felt precious in lives shaped by labor. Toward evening the roof repair was finally complete. Kitty sat near the edge for a moment beside his father watching sunset spread orange light across the Nile Valley. Workers returned slowly from the fields carrying tools over weary shoulders. Smoke rose from cooking fires. Boats drifted toward shore. The entire world seemed to soften beneath evening light. His father looked toward the river quietly. "When flood season comes," he said softly, "many things will become difficult." Kitty listened carefully. There will be more work. More waiting. More uncertainty. The older man paused for a moment. But also new soil. New planting. New life. Ancient Egyptian children learned early that hardship and hope often arrived together. Floodwaters destroyed and nourished. Labor exhausted and sustained. Patience itself carried both burden and strength. As darkness slowly covered the village once more, Kitty climbed down from the roof feeling tired but peaceful. Inside the house, supper waited. Warm lentils. Fresh bread. Cool water carried from the Nile. Simple comforts after another long day beneath the ancient sky. Later that night, after the younger children had fallen asleep, Kitty stepped briefly outside again. The air smelled clean after the rain. The stars shone brightly above the silent river. And somewhere beyond the darkness, floodwaters slowly traveled northward through distant lands toward the waiting villages of Egypt, carrying both hardship and renewal in their patient endless journey. The Nile flowed through the darkness with slow steady movement while the village rested beneath the stars. Coolness lingered faintly in the air after the rain from the night before, though warmth still rose gently from the earth and stone walls holding the memory of long sunlight. Kitty stood quietly outside the house for a few moments longer before returning inside. The village had become peaceful now. Only the soft crackling of distant cooking fires remained. A donkey shifted somewhere nearby. Palm leaves whispered gently overhead. The ancient world seemed to breathe slowly beside the river. At last Kitty lay down upon his woven mat once again. His younger brother turned sleepily beside him before becoming still. The room smelled faintly of damp reeds from the roof repairs completed earlier that evening. Soon the boy drifted into sleep. Dreams carried him through familiar places. Fields shimmering beneath heat. Marshes buzzing with insects. Boats rocking gently beside the docks. The endless movement of the Nile beneath bright skies. Before dawn arrived, the village remained wrapped in deep blue darkness. Yet already some workers had begun waking. Ancient life beside the river followed rhythms older than memory itself. Bread needed baking before sunrise. Water needed carrying before the heat became unbearable. Kitty woke slowly to the sound of his mother stirring grain in a clay bowl. Outside, stars still filled the sky. He sat upright carefully, feeling the familiar heaviness in his limbs. His body carried small aches almost constantly now. Sore shoulders. Stiff fingers. Tired legs. Yet these discomforts no longer surprised him. Children in ancient Egypt grew accustomed to carrying fatigue the way they carried baskets or water jars. Quietly. Without expecting relief to arrive quickly. Today the village would begin preparing storage rooms near the fields before flood season arrived fully. Grain and tools needed protecting from rising water. Walls required strengthening. Supplies needed moving to higher ground. Flood season brought life to Egypt, but also endless work. Before sunrise, groups of workers already moved toward the storage buildings carrying mud baskets, straw, wooden supports, and tools. The morning air felt soft and cool for a little while. Mist drifted low above the canals. Birds called quietly from the reeds. Kitty walked beside his father through narrow paths still damp from the earlier rain. Their sandals pressed softly into the earth while the eastern horizon slowly brightened into pale gold. Ahead, the storage buildings stood beside the fields like large sleeping shapes against the dawn. Several walls had weakened from age and moisture over past seasons. Workers gathered around them quietly, preparing for another long day of repair. The smell there was strong and familiar. Mud. Dry grain. Dust. Old straw warming beneath early sunlight. Kitty joined a line of boys carrying wet clay from a nearby pit toward the damaged walls. The clay felt cool and heavy inside the woven baskets balanced against their hips. Back and forth they walked. Again. 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 Repetition shaped nearly every part of ancient labor. At first Kitty had hated such work. The endless carrying. The aching shoulders. The feeling that progress came painfully slowly. But over time something inside him had changed. He no longer expected difficult tasks to end quickly. Patience had settled quietly into his body like river water sinking slowly into soil. Nearby, older workers reinforced wooden beams supporting the roof while women mixed fresh mud plaster using straw and water. The work moved steadily beneath the growing sunlight. No shouting. No rushing. Only careful coordinated effort. Children learned endurance partly because entire communities modeled it constantly. Adults around them rarely wasted energy fighting the unavoidable reality of labor. The sun climbed higher. Heat spread gradually across the fields. Sweat darkened linen clothing. Still the work continued. Kitty carried another clay basket toward the wall where an elderly builder pressed wet mud carefully into widening cracks. The old man nodded toward him. "Lower," he said softly. Kitty adjusted the basket. The builder worked slowly, smoothing the clay into place with weathered hands. "Strong walls require patience," he murmured. Another lesson. Always another lesson hidden inside ordinary work. Near mid-morning, TIAA arrived with several girls carrying water jars for the workers. Sweat glistened along her forehead beneath the brightening sun. Kitty accepted a clay cup from her gratefully. "The heat returns quickly after rain," she said quietly. He nodded. Already the brief coolness from previous days had disappeared beneath harsh sunlight. The Nile Valley seemed to breathe in cycles of relief and exhaustion. Cool dawns followed brutal afternoons. Floods followed droughts. Rest followed labor, though never for long. The workers paused briefly beneath woven shade coverings near the storage buildings. Kitty sat beside several older boys while warm wind drifted softly across the fields. One of them, Nebu, flexed his sore shoulders and sighed heavily. "Sometimes I feel old already," he muttered. The others laughed quietly, though not cruelly. Even children felt worn down at times by endless labor. An older worker nearby overheard them and smiled faintly while drinking water from a clay jar. "When you are truly old," he said softly, "you will still feel young inside your thoughts." The boys fell quiet. The older man looked toward the river beyond the fields. "But your hands will remember every season." Kiti glanced down at his own hands. Tiny scars crossed his fingers now from reeds, rope, tools, and rough stone. His palms had grown harder over recent years. The body remembered. That was true. After the short rest, work resumed again beneath rising heat. The afternoon stretched slowly across the valley. Carry clay. Repair cracks. Move grain jars. Strengthen supports. Repeat. Dust clung to sweaty skin while flies drifted lazily through the warm air. The smell of wet mud baking beneath sunlight filled everything around them. Ancient Egyptian children often experienced time differently from modern people. Without clocks or hurried schedules, days unfolded through physical rhythms instead. The movement of the sun. The feeling of hunger. The changing direction of shadows. The cooling of evening wind. Patience came naturally in worlds where life itself moved slowly. At midday, the workers shared a simple meal beneath shade beside the storage buildings. Bread. Beans. Onions. Water cool from buried clay jars. Kiti leaned back against the wall after eating, listening to distant sounds drifting across the fields. Somewhere far away, fishermen called softly to one another along the river. Donkeys brayed near the village paths. Palm leaves rustled in the warm breeze. The entire Nile Valley carried a sleepy stillness during the hottest hours. Beside him, his father sat quietly watching the fields. After a long silence, the older man spoke softly. "When flood season comes, the river will cover much of this land." Kiti followed his gaze toward the canals and farmlands stretching beside the Nile. "It is difficult every year," his father continued. "But when the waters leave, the soil becomes rich again." The boy listened carefully. Ancient life taught children to accept cycles rather than expect permanence. Fields flooded. Fields dried. Crops grew. Crops failed. Everything changed eventually. Patience meant trusting the slow return of balance even during difficult seasons. The afternoon wore on heavily beneath the heat. Several younger children grew sluggish from exhaustion while carrying supplies between buildings. One little boy stumbled and spilled part of a basket of dried grain onto the ground. For a moment panic flashed across his face. Grain was precious. Wasting food could bring harsh scolding in many households. But the old builder simply knelt beside him and began gathering the grain calmly back into the basket. "No fear," he said gently. "Only careful hands next time." The child nodded silently, relief softening his expression. Kiti watched the scene thoughtfully. The older generation understood hardship deeply enough that many no longer wasted energy on anger over small mistakes. Life already carried enough difficulty. As evening finally approached, shadows stretched long across the fields while sunlight softened into deep golden colors. The repaired walls stood stronger now, drying slowly beneath the warm breeze. Workers cleaned tools carefully before preparing for the walk home. Kiti's entire body felt exhausted. Yet beneath the exhaustion lived quiet satisfaction too. The work mattered. The storage rooms would survive flood season more safely now. Ancient children learned purpose through labor long before they learned comfort. The walk back toward the village felt peaceful beneath the evening sky. Smoke rose from cooking fires ahead. Boats drifted gently near the docks. The Nile reflected orange light beneath the lowering sun. Beside him, his father carried tools over one shoulder while walking silently through the dust. After some time, Kitty spoke softly. "Do you think patience can be learned by anyone?" His father considered the question carefully. Then he looked toward the river. "The Nile teaches it to everyone eventually," he answered quietly. The words stayed with Kitty as darkness slowly gathered across the ancient land. That night, after supper, he sat outside beside the doorway once more while stars appeared overhead. Warm wind moved softly through the palms. The village grew quiet. And somewhere beyond the sleeping fields, floodwaters continued their slow patient journey toward Egypt, just as they had for countless generations before. The night over the Nile had grown deep and still again, as if the entire valley had settled into a long, gentle breath. The wind was softer now than it had been in recent days, only passing through the palm leaves with a faint whisper that rose and faded without urgency. Kitty sat quietly outside the house longer than usual. The ground beneath him still held the warmth of the day, slowly releasing it into the night air. Somewhere nearby, a cooking fire had burned down to glowing embers. A few final sparks drifted upward and disappeared into the darkness like tiny fading stars. Inside the house, his family slept. Outside, the river continued its quiet movement beyond the fields, unseen but always present. Kitty felt something unusual in the stillness that night. Not excitement. Not fear. Something softer. A sense of waiting that did not feel heavy, only patient, as if the world itself was preparing for something slow and natural. He did not understand it fully. But life beside the Nile often felt like that. A quiet sense that change was always approaching, even when nothing looked different on the surface. Eventually he returned inside and lay down again. Sleep came gently, like drifting water. Before dawn, the village stirred with soft early movement once more. The sky was still dark, but the eastern edge of the horizon carried the faintest suggestion of light returning. Workers were already preparing near the river. Boats were being checked. Ropes tightened. Storage baskets arranged. There was a calm seriousness in the air that morning, different from ordinary days. Kitty noticed it even before anyone spoke. His father moved more carefully than usual while fastening a rope outside. His mother packed extra bread into a cloth bundle without explanation. Even the younger children seemed quieter than normal. Something was coming closer. Not sudden. Not dramatic. But steady. Like the river itself rising slowly against the land. After a simple meal, Kitty followed his father toward the fields, though their path was different this morning. Instead of heading to canals or storage buildings, they walked toward higher ground near the edge of the farmland. Other villagers moved in the same direction. Groups of men, women, and children carrying tools, baskets, and supplies. The path slowly filled with people all heading toward the same place. No one hurried. The Nile did not allow rushing in moments like this. The flood season was arriving. Not all at once. But gradually, the river was beginning to spread. When they reached the higher embankments, Kitty saw it clearly for the first time. The water had changed. It was not violent. Not chaotic. But it had expanded, quietly and steadily, across areas that had been dry only days before. Shallow fields now held thin layers of moving water reflecting pale morning sky. The Nile had begun its annual transformation of the land. Workers stood together watching in silence. Some carried supplies up from lower fields. Others checked boundaries and marked where water had already reached. The sound of it was subtle. Water moving through soil. Gentle currents brushing against reeds. Occasional splashes where deeper channels had filled. Kitty stood beside his father looking down at the spreading water. "It is early this year," someone nearby murmured. Another voice replied softly, "Or just steady." There was no panic in the group. Only awareness. The people of Egypt had lived beside this river for so long that flood season was not feared in the way outsiders might imagine. It was difficult, yes. It required effort, adjustment, patience. But it was also life itself. Without it, the land would dry. Without it, crops would fail. Without it, nothing would grow. Kitty watched as water slowly moved across fields that only yesterday had been dry earth. The transformation felt almost unreal in its calmness. The land was not being destroyed. It was being changed. Carefully. Slowly. Predictably. Like breathing. His father placed a hand briefly on his shoulder. "Now we prepare," he said quietly. The rest of the morning was spent moving supplies from lower storage areas to higher ground. Grain jars were carried carefully. Tools were lifted from sheds. Small structures near canals were reinforced or partially dismantled depending on risk. Everything was done with steady hands. No rushing. No shouting. Just continuous movement. Kitty carried baskets of grain alongside other boys, walking back and forth between flooded edges and safer ground. The work was heavier than usual because paths were soft and uneven from moisture. Yet nobody stopped. The river demanded adjustment, not resistance. As the sun rose higher, the floodwaters became more visible across the landscape. Thin shimmering sheets of water reflected bright light between reeds and field boundaries. Birds gathered in larger numbers now, shifting to drier areas. Farm animals were guided carefully toward raised pens. The entire valley was reorganizing itself quietly. By midday, the heat returned strongly above the rising waters. The contrast between bright sunlight and shallow flooding created a shimmering effect across the fields. Kitty paused briefly beside a raised embankment, resting a clay jar against his knees. Tiaa stood nearby watching the water flow slowly between the reeds. "It looks like the land is disappearing," she said softly. Kitty looked at it for a long moment. But then he noticed something else. The water was not taking everything away. It was covering. Not destroying. Transforming. He remembered what his father had said earlier. The soil becomes rich again. Ancient children learned early that appearances often hid deeper cycles. Loss and renewal existed together in the same movement. Work continued into the afternoon as more areas became submerged. Some lower paths now required boats instead of walking. Small wooden vessels moved slowly between newly flooded sections carrying supplies and people. Kitty helped load baskets onto a shallow boat near the edge of the fields. The water lapped gently against the wood as he stepped carefully inside. For the first time, parts of the land felt unfamiliar beneath him. The river had expanded into spaces that were once familiar paths. Yet the movement of the boat remained calm. Steady hands guided it through shallow water between reeds. Nearby, older workers directed children on where to stand and how to balance safely. "Slow movements," one man reminded gently. "Like the river," another added. Everything again returned to patience. Even flood season did not remove it. It deepened it. By late afternoon, much of the lower farmland had become shallow water filled with reeds, floating plants, and reflections of sky. Higher areas remained dry, where workers gathered to plan the next steps for planting and relocation of supplies. Kitty stood beside his father on a raised ridge looking over the transformed landscape. The Nile now stretched wider than before, like a living body breathing outward across the land. "It will stay like this for many days," his father said quietly. Kitty nodded. He understood now that nothing about this process was sudden, even if it appeared that way at first glance. Everything happened slowly. Even change. Especially change. As evening arrived, workers began returning toward the village along higher paths and boat routes. The flooded fields reflected deep orange light from the setting sun, creating a quiet glowing surface across the valley. The journey home felt different today. Some walked. Some used boats. Some carried tools above rising water. But all moved together in the same direction. Toward shelter. Toward rest. Toward the steady rhythm of night. When Kitty finally reached his home, exhaustion settled deeply into his body. His clothes were damp at the edges from splashes of river water. His hands smelled faintly of wet wood and mud. Inside, his mother had already prepared food. Simple. Warm. Familiar. The family gathered together as the sound of distant water flowed through the night outside the village. After eating, Kitty stepped outside briefly once more. The Nile, now wider and closer than before, moved gently past the edge of the fields under the darkening sky. The floodwaters reflected stars beginning to appear overhead. He stood there quietly for a long time, watching the river reshape the land with calm certainty. There was hardship in it. Yes. More work. More adjustment. More waiting. But also something else. A feeling that nothing was ever truly lost. Only changed. The Nile continued flowing through the night, patient and endless, carrying the ancient world forward in its slow and steady rhythm. The night after the first wide floodwaters felt different across the Nile Valley. The village did not feel disturbed, only adjusted, as if the land itself had shifted into a new, quieter rhythm. Water now lay closer to the homes than before, resting in still pools between reeds and fields that had once been dry paths only days earlier. Kitty stood for a while longer outside. The reflection of stars on the water made it feel as if the sky had bent downward and settled gently into the earth. A soft breeze moved across the surface, breaking the reflections into slow, shimmering lines before they formed again. Somewhere nearby, a boat drifted slowly along a submerged path, guided carefully by a man pushing against a long wooden pole. The movement made almost no sound, only a faint ripple spreading outward before disappearing. The world had become quieter in a new way. Not empty. Just slower. Inside the house, the family slept early that night. Flood season always brought longer days and heavier work. Even conversations shortened. Even meals became more quiet. The body asked for rest more urgently when the river changed its shape. Kitty lay down and drifted into sleep again. In his dreams, water spread across fields endlessly, but it did not frighten him. Instead, it moved like something familiar, something that had always belonged there even before he had noticed it. Morning arrived with pale light spreading over a wider river than before. The Nile now touched places it had not reached earlier in the season. The valley looked softer, as if the land had been gently smoothed and reshaped overnight. Workers moved carefully along raised paths and embankments. Boats replaced footsteps in several areas where canals had filled completely. Even the sound of daily life had changed slightly, with more water sounds now mixing into everything else. Kitty walked beside his father toward one of the raised storage areas where grain was being checked again. The air smelled cooler near the water, even as the sun rose higher. Along the way, they passed small groups of villagers guiding livestock toward higher ground. Goats and cattle moved slowly, occasionally stopping as if uncertain about the changed terrain beneath them. Children helped guide them gently, their hands resting on ropes or wooden poles. No one rushed. Rushing was useless against water that moved according to its own ancient rhythm. At the storage area, workers gathered under woven shade coverings while inspecting grain jars and sealed containers. Some jars had been lifted higher overnight. Others were being moved again just in case the water rose further. An older man checked the seals on a clay vessel carefully, pressing the clay lid down and nodding once. "Safe for now," he said softly. The words carried a kind of calm relief. Kitty helped stack containers in a higher section of the structure. His arms already felt tired from the previous days of labor, yet the work continued steadily as always. Beside him, Nebu worked quietly, occasionally glancing toward the flooded fields visible from the upper ridge. "It feels strange," Nebu said after a while. Kitty followed his gaze. The water below stretched across wide sections of land, reflecting sky and palm trees like a second world lying beneath the first. "Strange how?" Kitty asked. Nebu hesitated. "Like the land is sleeping." Kitty considered that. It was not an unpleasant thought. The fields did not feel destroyed. They felt covered, resting beneath the slow movement of water, waiting for their return. As the morning continued, more supplies arrived from lower areas. Workers in boats brought tools, baskets, and smaller items that had been left behind before the waters rose further. The rhythm of the village had fully adapted now. Walking became rowing. Paths became channels. Fields became water surfaces. And yet life continued without interruption. By midday, heat returned strongly above the flooded valley. Sunlight reflected intensely from the water, filling the air with brightness that seemed to stretch in every direction. Kitty sat briefly on a raised stone edge beside his father, resting from work. Below them, boats moved slowly between partially submerged fields where reeds stood like tall green markers in the water. His father spoke quietly after a long silence. "When I was young," he said, "I feared the flood season." Kitty turned slightly toward him. "Why?" His father looked out across the water. "Because I thought it meant loss." The words drifted softly into the warm air. "But over time," he continued, "I learned it is only change that arrives slowly enough for us to forget it is change." Kitty listened carefully. The flood did not come like sudden destruction. It arrived like a gradual shift in the world itself. So gentle that fear had to be learned before acceptance could be forgotten. The river did not act violently. It simply became something else for a time. And then became itself again later. After rest, they returned to work, helping adjust storage supports and reinforcing higher pathways used for movement between flooded areas. The work required careful attention now, because wet ground could shift unexpectedly beneath weight. Everything demanded caution. Everything demanded patience. Even walking. Even carrying. Even standing still for too long. As afternoon passed, Kitty was sent with a small group to deliver supplies by boat to a cluster of workers stationed farther along the flooded fields. The journey took them through quiet water pathways between reeds and partially submerged palms. The boat moved slowly. Each push of the pole created gentle ripples that spread outward and dissolved into the wider water. The silence on the water felt deep. Only the occasional call of birds broke it. The world seemed larger out here, where land and water blended into one another. Kitty watched a palm tree rising from the water ahead, its trunk disappearing into the flood while its crown still reached upward into open air. It looked both grounded and floating at the same time. Nebu, who traveled with him, noticed it too. "It looks like it forgot where the land is," he said softly. Kitty nodded. Or maybe the land had simply moved beneath it for a while. They delivered the supplies and turned back toward the village as the sun began its slow descent. The return journey felt even quieter. The water reflected evening light now, turning gold and soft orange between the reeds. Far in the distance, the raised parts of the village appeared like small islands surrounded by shifting water. As they approached, smoke from cooking fires rose gently into the cooling air. The smell of bread and lentils carried faintly across the water. Home always revealed itself through smell before sight during flood season. That evening, the family ate together as usual, though the space inside the house felt slightly more enclosed due to stored supplies and rearranged belongings. Everything had been moved higher or closer to central support walls. Life adapted even inside the home. After supper, Kitty sat near the doorway again, looking out across the flood waters. The stars returned slowly overhead, reflected faintly in the water below. It looked as if the night sky had doubled itself, one above and one resting gently upon the earth. The Nile moved through both sky and water together, endless and patient. Kitty stayed there for a long time, listening to the soft movement of water against submerged fields. Nothing felt rushed. Nothing felt broken. Only changed. And in that change, life continued quietly, as it always had beside the ancient river that never stopped teaching patience through every season it brought. The night settled gently over the flooded valley, and the Nile continued its wide, quiet movement through the land. The water no longer felt like something separate from life. It had become part of everything: fields, paths, reflections, and silence itself. Kitty remained seated near the doorway for a long time. The air was cooler now, drifting softly across the surface of the flood waters nearby. Each small ripple carried moonlight for a moment before releasing it back into darkness. The village behind him had grown still, with only the faintest sounds of shifting wood or distant night birds breaking the quiet. Inside the house, his family slept. Outside, the world rested in water and starlight. He finally lay down and let sleep take him again. The days that followed continued in the same slow rhythm. Flood season had fully arrived now, and the valley had accepted its new shape for a time. Boats moved where footsteps once had been. Reeds rose from shallow water like green lines marking forgotten paths beneath the surface. Kitty had grown used to waking each morning to the soft sound of water nearby. It no longer felt strange. It felt natural, like a second version of the world unfolding beside the first. One morning, before the sun had fully risen, he joined a group of workers heading deeper into the flooded fields. The sky was pale and quiet, with thin clouds drifting slowly overhead. The boat they used was narrow and worn smooth by years of river travel. It creaked softly as they stepped inside, shifting their weight carefully so as not to disturb its balance. A long wooden pole guided them forward through shallow water that spread across what had once been farmland. Kitty sat near the middle, watching as submerged plants sway gently beneath the surface. Occasionally, the tip of a reed broke through the water, trembling slightly in the early wind. The world felt half-hidden, as if the land was sleeping just beneath their movement. Nearby, Nebu leaned forward and pointed toward a cluster of trees standing partially submerged. "It feels like the river has taken everything," he said quietly. Kitty watched the trees for a moment. But then he noticed something else. The branches still reached upward. Birds still rested on them. Life still continued even here, in this changed space. It has not taken it, Kitty replied softly. It has only covered it for now. Nebu didn't answer immediately. He seemed to think about that. The boat continued forward in slow, steady motion. Floodwater moved around them without sound except for the gentle brushing of wood against water. Occasionally, they passed workers in other boats, all moving with the same calm purpose, checking boundaries, carrying supplies, or marking safe routes. Everything was measured. Everything was careful. The river demanded attention, not speed. By mid-morning, they reached a raised structure where a group of workers had gathered. The area was slightly higher, allowing dry ground for storage and rest. The men there were repairing rope systems used to secure boats during stronger currents. Thick knots were being tied carefully around wooden posts that rose from the water like dark markers. An older worker handed Kitty a rope and showed him where to secure it. "Not tie too quickly," he said. "Let it settle first." Kitty nodded and followed the instruction. He wrapped the rope slowly, adjusting it with careful hands. The fibers were damp and rough, smelling faintly of river water and sun-warmed wood. Around him, others worked in quiet coordination. The only sounds were water moving, rope tightening, and occasional soft instructions spoken without urgency. Time felt different here on the floodwaters. It did not feel like something passing quickly. It felt like something stretching gently in all directions. After some time, the workers paused to rest beneath a simple shade structure built on higher ground. The sun had risen higher now, turning the water into a wide field of light. Kitty drank from a clay jar and looked out across the flooded landscape. From here, everything looked peaceful. But also changed. Fields were no longer fields. Paths no longer paths. Yet nothing felt lost. It only felt paused. Beside him, one of the older men spoke quietly. "When the waters first rise, people think the land is gone," he said. He took a slow breath. "But it is only resting." No one replied, but the words seemed to settle into everyone listening. Even Nebu stayed quiet for a long time. The return journey began as the sun slowly moved downward. The water reflected the sky more deeply now, blending light and motion into a single quiet surface. Kitty rested his hands on the edge of the boat, watching ripples form and disappear beneath them. Each movement felt small. Each ripple temporary. Yet everything together formed the path they followed. On the way back, they passed a partially submerged grove of palm trees. Their trunks rose from the water like tall still pillars, while their leaves moved gently above the flood. It looked like another world had risen beneath them. A quiet, patient world of water and reflection. Nebu stared at it for a while before speaking softly. "Do you think it will always come back?" he asked. Kitty thought for a moment. He had seen only a few cycles of the flood so far in his life. But even in those few years, he had already learned something important. "It always has," he said. The answer was simple, but it felt complete. The river returned. The land returned. Work returned. Even exhaustion returned. But so did food. So did growth. So did life. By the time they reached the village again, the afternoon light had softened. People moved along raised paths carrying supplies, while boats tied carefully along the edges of submerged fields. The rhythm of life continued without interruption. Kitty helped unload the boat and carry supplies toward storage areas. His arms were tired, but the work no longer felt heavy in the same way it once had. There was familiarity in it now. A steady understanding of what each movement required. Even fatigue had become predictable. Predictable things felt easier to carry. As evening arrived, the village settled again into its familiar nighttime stillness. The floodwaters outside reflected the last light of the sky before turning dark and calm once more. Kitty sat outside after supper, watching the stars appear slowly overhead. The river moved beneath them, wide and patient. Nothing hurried. Nothing resisted. Everything simply continued. And in that quiet continuation, the ancient valley remained alive, held gently between water, sky, and time itself. The night over the flooded valley arrived without urgency, as if it had been waiting patiently all along for the day to finish. The stars appeared slowly, one by one, above the wide surface of water that now covered much of the lower land. Their reflections shimmered faintly below, creating a second sky resting quietly upon the earth. Kitty sat near the doorway again, as he often did now. The habit had become part of his evenings, like the river becoming part of the fields. He watched the water move gently beyond the edge of the village, listening to the soft rhythm of it brushing against reeds and submerged paths. Everything felt slower during flood season. Even thoughts. Even breathing. Inside the house, his family had already settled into sleep. The day's labor had been steady, with long hours spent adjusting ropes, guiding boats, and carrying supplies between raised paths. No one spoke much anymore at night. Exhaustion softened words before they could form. Kitty eventually lay down and drifted into sleep once more. The days continued like this. Not separate. Not sharply divided. But flowing together, like the river itself. Each morning arrived with pale light spreading across the water. Each evening returned with quiet reflections of stars on the flooded fields. Between them, life moved in slow, careful patterns shaped entirely by the river's presence. One morning, Kitty woke earlier than usual. The air felt especially still, and the light coming through the doorway was soft and gray, as if the sky itself had not yet decided how bright it wanted to become. He stepped outside quietly. The village was already awake in parts, but there was a calmness in the movement that suggested routine rather than urgency. People were used to this now. The flood had settled into its place. Boats waited along the edges of submerged paths. Ropes hung neatly from wooden posts. Children sat near the water watching small ripples drift outward and fade. Kitty joined a group preparing to travel toward a distant section of the flooded fields where older irrigation markers needed inspection. The journey would take most of the morning. The boat they used moved slowly through shallow water that stretched endlessly between reeds and partially submerged trees. The world felt wide and soft, with no clear boundaries between land and river anymore. Only differences in depth. Only changes in reflection. Nebu sat across from him, tracing lines in the water with a thin wooden stick as they moved. "It feels like we are inside the river now," he said quietly. Kitty watched the water around them. "We have always been beside it," he replied. Nebu considered this. "But now it is closer." Kitty nodded slightly. That was true. The river had not changed its nature, but it had changed its reach. It touched more of their world now, surrounding them in a way that made everything feel temporarily transformed. Yet there was still no fear in it. Only adjustment. The boat continued forward through a narrow passage between reeds. The plants rose above the water like tall green lines marking where paths once existed. Occasional birds lifted from hidden nests as they passed, then settled again farther away. The sound of movement remained gentle. Water against wood. Soft wind through plants. Distant calls across the flooded valley. By mid-morning, they reached a raised inspection point where older workers waited. The structure stood above the water, built on strong wooden supports that had been reinforced for flood season. From there, the landscape stretched wide and silent. Fields were now vast pools of water broken by occasional trees, raised embankments, and floating clusters of reeds. The horizon itself seemed softened, as if the entire world had been gently blurred by reflection. An older worker greeted them with a slow nod. "Check the markers," he said simply. No more explanation was needed. Kitty and Nebu moved carefully along the edge of the raised structure, inspecting wooden poles that marked boundaries beneath the water. These markers were important. They showed where fields ended, where canals ran, where boats should travel safely. Kitty leaned over slightly, peering into the water where a submerged marker was partially visible. The river light distorted its shape, making it seem longer than it truly was. He adjusted the rope tied to its top, securing it more firmly to the structure above. Everything required care during flood season. Even stillness. Even observation. After some time, the workers gathered again under the raised shelter to rest. The midday sun was strong now, turning the water into a bright, almost endless surface of light. Kitty sat quietly, resting his arms on his knees. Nebu lay back against a wooden support, eyes half closed. "It never feels the same twice," Nebu murmured. Kitty looked out across the flooded valley. That was true. Even though the cycle repeated each year, it never felt identical. The water rose differently. The wind changed. The fields responded in small, subtle ways. The river was the same. But also not the same. An older worker nearby spoke without looking up. "That is why we watch it carefully." His voice was calm, as if he had said the same thing many times before. "Not to control it," he continued softly, "but to learn it again." The words lingered in the warm air. After resting, they began the return journey. The boat moved more slowly now, carried by a gentle current that shifted between submerged paths. The sun had begun its descent, casting long golden light across the water. Kitty watched reflections ripple beneath them. Sky above. Sky below. Two versions of the same world moving together. On the way back, they passed a quiet section of flooded fields where tall grasses moved gently just beneath the surface. Occasionally, small air bubbles rose and burst silently. It felt like the land was still there, only hidden. Waiting. Nebu watched it too. "I wonder if it remembers us," he said quietly. Kitty did not answer immediately. He thought about the fields they had walked through only a short time before the flood arrived. The paths, the soil, the work done there season after season. "It is still there," he said finally. "Just not showing itself right now." Nebu nodded slowly, as if that made sense in a way words alone could not fully explain. By the time they returned to the village, evening light was already spreading across the valley. Boats lined the edges of the water like dark resting shapes. Smoke rose from cooking fires along higher ground. The rhythm of daily life continued unchanged, even though everything beneath it had shifted. Kitty helped secure the boat and carry supplies toward storage areas. His movements were steady now, almost automatic. Repetition had shaped his body into familiarity with this kind of work. Even tiredness felt familiar. Even silence felt familiar. That night, after eating, he sat once more near the doorway. The floodwaters stretched out before him, reflecting the deepening night sky. The village behind him rested. The river in front of him moved gently. And somewhere far beyond the visible horizon, the great waters of the land continued their slow journey, shaping everything quietly, without hurry, without pause, as they had always done. The night over the Nile Valley felt deeper than usual, as if the world had finally settled into its most quiet form. The floodwaters lay still across the lower fields, holding the sky in their surface like a second, softer universe. Stars above and stars below drifted together in silence, separated only by the gentle movement of water. Kitty sat near the doorway for a long time, not thinking of anything in particular. Or perhaps he was thinking of everything at once in a slow, drifting way that had no clear shape. The days of flood season had changed something in him without announcing it. Nothing dramatic. Nothing sudden. Just a quiet understanding that life moved in long cycles, and every cycle required patience to live through. Inside the house, his family slept. The familiar sounds of breathing and stillness filled the small space behind him. Outside, the village was calm, resting on higher ground, adjusted now to the presence of water that had reshaped its surroundings. The Nile continued flowing beneath the night. Always moving. Always returning. Kitty finally lay down, and sleep came gently, as it always did after long days of labor and repetition. Not heavy. Not forced. Just a slow fading into rest. And in the days that followed, life continued in its steady rhythm. The floodwaters remained for a time, spreading across fields and then slowly pausing in their expansion. Boats carried people where paths once had been. Work shifted into new patterns shaped by water and waiting. Every task required care, every movement measured against the softness of the flooded land. But even this did not last forever. One morning, the change began quietly. Not with sound. Not with warning. But with observation. The water, which had spread across so much of the valley, no longer seemed to rise. Instead, it lingered. Still. Patient. And then, almost imperceptibly, it began to recede. Day by day, the river returned to its deeper channel. Reeds that had been submerged began to reappear above the surface. Paths that had been hidden slowly reformed beneath drying earth. The land did not rush to change. It revealed itself gradually, as if it too had learned patience from the river. Kitty noticed these changes while working with his father along the higher embankments. At first, it was only a slight difference in distance between water and shore. Then more exposed soil along the edges. Then small familiar shapes of fields returning beneath the light. One morning, Nebu pointed quietly from the boat. "There," he said. Kitty looked. A narrow path that had been underwater for many days was now visible again, glistening with damp earth. It felt like seeing something remembered. Not new. Not old. Just returning. The village did not celebrate the withdrawal of the flood. It simply adjusted again, as it always did. Boats were gradually used less often. Walking paths slowly reopened. Fields were checked, cleaned, and prepared for planting once more. Work shifted again. As it always did. The rhythm never stopped. It only changed shape. Kitty walked with his father across newly exposed ground one morning. The soil was dark and rich beneath their feet, soft from the river's gift. Farmers nearby tested it gently with their hands, already preparing for the next season of planting. His father knelt and pressed the soil between his fingers. "Now it begins again," he said softly. Kitty looked across the wide valley. What had once been water was now earth again. What had once been still land would soon become fields of grain and green life. The cycle was complete. And not complete. Always continuing. In that moment, Kitty understood something without needing it explained. Patience was not simply waiting for hardship to pass. It was learning to live inside the movement of change itself. To work when there was work. To rest when there was rest. To accept when the river rose. And to begin again when it fell. The Nile did not teach this with words. It taught it through time. Through repetition. Through seasons that returned again and again without asking permission. That evening, as the sun lowered over the restored fields, Kiti sat beside the river once more. The water now flowed in its narrower, familiar channel, no longer covering the land but still present, still essential, still alive. The wind moved gently through the reeds. Smoke rose from distant cooking fires. The village returned fully to its land-based rhythms, but the memory of water remained in the soil beneath it. Kiti watched the river quietly. He thought of everything he had seen across these seasons. The labor. The waiting. The repairs. The boats. The flooded fields and their return. And he understood, in a simple way that needed no explanation, that nothing in life remained fixed. Not hardship. Not ease. Not land. Not water. Only movement. Only change. Only time. As darkness began to settle again over the Nile Valley, Kiti stood and turned toward home. Behind him, the river continued flowing through the night as it always had, patient and endless, carrying the world forward without hurry. And the land, now restored, rested quietly beneath the stars, ready once again for work, for growth, and for another slow journey through the living cycle of the ancient world.